Let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of maps. Somewhere in the red heart of Australia, under a sky so clear that the stars seem close enough to touch, an elder begins to sing. The song is ancient, far older than any piece of parchment or clay tablet, older than farming itself, older perhaps than any surviving object made by human hands. And as the elder sings, the landscape comes alive with meaning. That ridge of sandstone marks the place where a great spirit paused during the time of creation. That cluster of trees stands where an ancestor stopped to rest. The dry creek bed running toward the horizon follows the path a sacred being took when the world was being born. This is what the Aboriginal Australians call a songline, and it is, in the most profound sense you can imagine, a map. The Aboriginal peoples have lived on their continent for at least 65,000 years, and in that time they developed what may be the oldest and most complete navigation system in all of human history. Their songlines, sometimes called dreaming tracks, are invisible paths that cross the entire land, weaving together a web of knowledge so detailed that a person who knew the right songs could walk thousands of kilometers through territory they had never visited before. One particularly long songline stretches over 3,500 kilometers, connecting the deep desert to the coast. The songs contained practical information, things like where to find water, which foods were safe to eat, which areas to avoid, and whose country you were passing through. But they also held something deeper, a seamless blending of geographic knowledge with spiritual meaning, natural history, and cultural memory. The landscape and the story were one and the same. What made the system even more remarkable was the way it handled language. Songlines often crossed the territories of many different groups who spoke different languages. When the song reached a new territory, the words changed, but the melody stayed the same. A traveler who did not speak the local language could still follow the songline simply by recognizing the tune. It was, in effect, a continental navigation network encoded in music, one that required no writing, no paper, and no instruments beyond the human voice and memory. But there is a quiet sadness at the heart of this story. The songlines were invisible to those who did not know the songs. When European settlers arrived in Australia, they looked out at the land and saw what they believed was an empty continent, a place with no signs of ownership or spatial organization. They could not see the map because they could not hear it. And this failure of perception would become one of the great tragedies of colonial history, because the most ancient mapping tradition on Earth was one that left no mark on paper, stone, or clay. Meanwhile, across the world and across a vast stretch of time, other human communities were beginning to scratch and carve their spatial knowledge onto physical surfaces. In a cave in the mountains of northern Spain, archaeologists found a small stone, easily held in one hand, covered with engraved lines and marks that appear to show the local rivers, mountains, and hunting routes. That stone is roughly 14,000 years old, and it may be the oldest physical map found in Western Europe. Not far away, in the famous painted caves of southwestern France, clusters of dots among the animal paintings may represent patterns of stars in the night sky. If that reading is correct, then the oldest surviving maps are not of the Earth at all, but of the heavens. The night sky was our first atlas, and for thousands of years, the stars served as the primary way for people to find their bearings across vast, featureless landscapes. And in the Italian Alps, on a flat surface of rock polished smooth by ancient glaciers, there is something called the Bedolina map, a massive stone 9 meters long and 4 meters wide, covered with more than 100 carved figures. The carvings date from the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age, roughly 3,000 years ago, and they seem to show cultivated fields, mountain paths, warriors, animals, and wooden huts. It is one of the most ancient maps of a real lived-in landscape anywhere in the world. Perhaps the most famous candidate for the oldest map of all is a wall painting found in the ruins of a settlement in what is now central Turkey, dating back roughly 8,000 years. The painting stretches about 9 feet across a wall and seems to show a view of the settlement from above, with rectangular buildings laid out in rows and a twin-peaked mountain rising in the background. What makes it so striking is the perspective. The person who painted it was standing right beside the wall, but they imagined the scene as if looking down from a great height. That ability to see the world from a viewpoint that no human eye had ever actually occupied, that is the fundamental leap of imagination that makes all map-making possible. Can you picture that for a moment? Someone kneeling beside a wall 8,000 years ago, painting the world as if seen from the sky. We should be careful, though, not to assume that all of these ancient images were maps in the way we understand the word today. Scholars debate whether any of them truly qualify. A map, in the strictest sense, is a deliberate representation of spatial relationships meant to communicate geographic information to others. Some of these ancient images might be maps, or they might be murals, spiritual diagrams, or something else entirely that we do not have a name for. But what we can say with certainty is that the human urge to represent the world in spatial terms is very, very old. Long before anyone pressed a stylus into wet clay or drew a line on a sheet of paper, human beings were finding ways to organize, remember, and share their knowledge of the places they lived in. Whether through song, carving, painting, or sculpted stone, the desire to say this is where we are and this is how to get there seems to be as deeply rooted in our species as language itself. Scientists have even found that our brains contain specialized cells that fire in patterns matching our position and movement through space, creating a kind of inner map of our surroundings. The mapping impulse, it seems, is not merely something we learned. It is something built into the very structure of our minds. And it is from this deep, ancient, and universal impulse that everything else in the story of maps would eventually grow. The great atlases and globes, the satellite images and phone apps, the military maps and treasure maps, all of them trace their ancestry back to these first tentative scratches on stone, these first songs sung under southern stars, these first attempts by human beings to hold the shape of the world in their hands. And so, let us move forward now to a place where the rivers flood each spring and the clay is soft enough to write upon. In the spring of 1899, in the sun-baked ruins of what had once been the great city of Mappae, an archaeological team carefully lifted a small clay tablet from the earth. The tablet was not much to look at, just a flat piece of baked clay that could fit comfortably in 2 cupped hands, its surface covered with fine lines scratched by a reed. But when those lines were studied closely, something remarkable became clear. The tablet was a map, a detailed plan of the city itself, showing walls, gates, temples, canals, and the farmland surrounding them. It had been made sometime between 1500 and 1300 years before the Common Era, and when modern researchers compared its lines and angles to photographs taken from above, the match was startling, accurate to within 10% of the real dimensions. This was no rough sketch. This was the work of someone who understood measurement, who had taken careful note of distances and angles and translated them onto a flat surface with real precision. The Mappae city plan is among the oldest true maps ever discovered, and it tells us something important about the people who made it. The civilization of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was not merely recording the world around it. It was measuring the world, counting it, and organizing it with a care that would not be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. Mesopotamia was a place where mapping was not a luxury but a necessity. The great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flooded every year just as the Nile did in Egypt. The floodwaters shifted channels, deposited thick layers of mud, and washed away the markers that separated one person's field from the next. In a society where land ownership meant everything, Where temple estates and royal grants formed the very foundation of the economy, the ability to re-establish property lines after each flood season was essential. And so the people of Mesopotamia became surveyors, using knotted ropes and measuring rods to divide the floodplain into carefully defined plots. Their tools were standardized across the kingdom. They used a unit of measurement roughly 6 meters in length, and surveying rods of this size appear in stone carvings and government records. Combined with a number system based on 60, the same system that gives us 360 degrees in a circle today, their map-making achieved a consistency that was quietly remarkable for its time. The clay tablets that survive from this era are wonderfully diverse. Some show individual fields, drawn with care and labeled with the owner's name and the field's size. Others show irrigation systems with winding canals branching into smaller channels that spread water across the farmland. Small circles scattered across the surface represent villages and settlements. Together, these tablets form what you might call the world's first system of land mapping, a careful effort to record, measure, and manage who owned what through drawings on clay. They were practical documents, made for practical reasons, settling disputes, collecting taxes, managing the flow of water, and running one of the world's first great civilizations. But the people of Mesopotamia also dreamed bigger. Sometime around the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era, in the ancient city of Sippar, about 60 kilometers north of Babylon, someone made a very different kind of map. This was not a property survey or an irrigation plan. This was a map of the entire world, or at least the entire world as the Babylonians understood it. Known today as the Babylonian map of the world, it is the oldest known attempt to draw the whole Earth on a single surface. The tablet shows the world as a flat circle surrounded by a ring of water labeled as the Bitter River, the Salt Sea. At the center flows the Euphrates, with Babylon marked proudly on its banks. Other cities and kingdoms are scattered around the disk. Beyond the encircling ocean, triangular shapes extend outward like the points of a star, representing distant, mysterious regions where strange creatures and supernatural things were said to exist. Imagine holding that small clay tablet in your hands. In the center, the world, your city, your river, your familiar landscape, and beyond the edges, the unknown, the places where the stories say wonders and terrors dwell. This double nature of the Babylonian world map, part geography and part mythology, part real observation and part spiritual belief, would prove to be one of the most lasting themes in the entire history of mapmaking. For as long as humans have been drawing maps, they have been using them not only to record where things are, but also to express what the world means. The Babylonians placed Babylon at the center of their world for the same reason that later cultures would place their own holy cities at the center of theirs, because the center of the map was the center of meaning, the place from which everything else gained its importance. The contributions of Mesopotamia to mapmaking go even deeper than any single map. It was here that the number system based on 60 was developed, the system that gave us the 360-degree circle still used in navigation and mapping today. When a Greek thinker, centuries later, proposed dividing the globe into degrees of latitude and longitude, he was building directly on foundations laid in the river kingdoms. And the rulers of Mesopotamia understood something that would remain true throughout the history of maps, that to map a territory is, in some deep way, to claim it. The kings of Babylon and Assyria ordered maps not only for the sake of good government, but as expressions of power, documents that said, "This is my land, measured and recorded under my authority," and so on, the flat plains between two great rivers in a landscape that had to be measured and mapped all over again after every flood. The foundations of map-making were laid, not with grand theories about the shape of the earth, but with the simple, urgent, deeply human need to know where things are, who owns them, and how to get from here to there. Let us travel now to another great river, one that flooded with even greater regularity, where a different civilization would take the art of measurement to extraordinary heights. Every summer, for as long as anyone could remember, the Nile rose. The great river swelled with rains that had fallen thousands of miles to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia, and its floodwaters spread across the Egyptian landscape in a vast, slow sheet of brown water that erased everything in its path. When the waters finally pulled back, weeks later, they left behind a thick layer of rich, dark soil, the fertile earth that made Egyptian farming possible and that gave the country its ancient name, the Black Land. But the flood also erased something less welcome. Every year, the boundary markers that separated one farmer's land from another's simply vanished beneath the water, and every year they had to be put back from scratch. This annual crisis of disappearing boundaries created something rather remarkable: the world's first professional surveyors. The Greeks called them the rope stretchers, and according to the Greek historian Herodotus, it was from their practical work along the Nile that the science of geometry itself was born. The word geometry literally means earth measurement, and in Egypt, that is exactly what it was. The rope stretchers carried their most important tool with them, a length of rope carefully treated with wax and resin to keep it from stretching, with 13 knots tied at equal intervals along its length. When pulled tight, this rope could be shaped into a triangle with sides in a ratio of 3 to 4 to 5, a combination that always produces a perfect right angle. This practical use of a mathematical principle that would later carry a Greek philosopher's name came centuries before that philosopher was born. It shows just how much mathematical understanding these Egyptian surveyors achieved through nothing more than everyday necessity. And the precision of their work was extraordinary. Think of the Great Pyramid, built around 2,560 years before the Common Era. Its base, measuring over 230 meters on each side, is accurate to within just 58 millimeters. The entire structure is aligned to the cardinal directions of the compass within a tiny fraction of a degree. These are not merely feats of building. They are feats of measurement, requiring the ability to record and control spatial relationships with an accuracy that the rest of the world would not match for a very long time. The act of measuring the land was not just a practical task in Egypt, it was a sacred one. When a new temple or important building was to be constructed, the pharaoh himself would take part in a ceremony called the stretching of the cord, personally pulling the knotted rope to define the building's foundations and point them toward the stars. The goddess of writing, mathematics, and measurement was depicted in temple carvings helping the pharaoh in this sacred act, a sign that surveying was considered a divine practice, not merely a technical one. In Egyptian thought, measurement was an expression of the cosmic order, a physical way of maintaining the harmony and balance that the pharaoh was duty-bound to uphold. Now, the most remarkable piece of map-making to survive from ancient Egypt is a document known as the Turin Papyrus Map, created around 1150 years before the Common Era by a scribe for an expedition ordered by the pharaoh. The expedition was heading into the eastern desert to a dry river valley that was one of the most important sources of building stone and gold in the kingdom. The map shows a stretch of about 15 kilometers of this valley, depicting where it meets two other valleys, the surrounding hills, a stone quarry, and a gold mine with its small settlement. What makes this map truly special is not just its age, but what it shows and how it shows it. It is the oldest surviving map that depicts the shape of the land itself, what we would call a topographical map. And it is also the oldest known map that uses color to represent different types of rock. The hills on either side of the valley are painted in different colors, one shade for one kind of stone, another shade for a different kind. The gravel in the valley floor is shown with dots of brown, green, and white, representing the different types of stone found there. This use of color to communicate information about the Earth beneath our feet would not become standard practice in the rest of the world for another 3,000 years. The map was found at a village in western Thebes, the place where the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived and worked. It now rests in a museum in the Italian city of Turin, brought there by a collector in the early 1800s. The papyrus is broken into fragments, and scholars have debated for decades about exactly how the pieces fit together, but even in its damaged state, it gives us an extraordinary glimpse into what Egyptian mapmakers could do. Beyond this one remarkable document, Egypt's map-making legacy is largely indirect. The Egyptians did not, so far as we know, try to draw maps of the world or to picture the shape of the Earth as a whole. Their mapping was intensely local and practical: field boundaries, building plans, mining routes, military paths. But the skills they built, the mathematical methods, the surveying techniques, the ability to measure and record the layout of the land with such care, would flow outward into the wider world around the Mediterranean. When Greek thinkers began to wonder about the shape of the Earth and whether it might be possible to draw a map of the whole planet, they built upon foundations that had been laid in the fields and quarries of Egypt. The rope stretchers eventually passed their knowledge to the Greeks, and from the Greeks it would pass to the Romans, and from the Romans to the medieval world, and from there to the scientific map makers of our own age. But it all began with a rope, 13 knots, and a river that flooded every year, erasing the world and asking that it be measured and drawn all over again. There is something deeply lovely about this beginning. The birth of surveying, the ancestor of all map-making, was driven not by curiosity or ambition, but by the simple, repeating need to answer a question that nature itself posed every single year: where does my land end and yours begin? It is a question that humans have been asking ever since, and every map ever made is, at its heart, an attempt to provide an answer. And so let us travel now across the Mediterranean to a place where thinkers began to ask an even larger question: not just where are things on the ground, but what is the shape of the Earth itself? On a summer afternoon in the Egyptian city of Syene, sometime around 240 years before the Common Era, a man stood beside a deep well and looked down. It was the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, and at noon the sun hung directly overhead. Its light fell straight down the well shaft, reaching the water at the bottom without casting any shadow on the walls. This was a well-known local curiosity, something the people of Syene took for granted. But 800 kilometers to the north, in the great city of Alexandria, a Greek scholar named Eratosthenes was thinking about that well and what it meant. Eratosthenes was the chief librarian at the famous Library of Alexandria, one of the sharpest minds of the ancient world. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a geographer, and a poet, a person who seemed to be the second best in the world at nearly everything, which is no small thing. On the same summer solstice, Eratosthenes measured the angle of the shadow cast by a vertical stick in Alexandria. The shadow fell at an angle of about 7 degrees, which is roughly 1/50th of a full circle. And from this single observation, he reasoned his way to one of the greatest measurements in human history. If the sun's rays were parallel, which they must be because the sun is so far away, then the angle of the shadow in Alexandria must equal the difference in position between the two cities on the curved surface of the Earth. That meant the distance between Syene and Alexandria was 1/50th of the total distance around the planet. Professional pace counters had measured that distance at roughly 5,000 units called stadia. Eratosthenes multiplied 5,000 by 50 and arrived at a figure of 250,000 stadia for the entire circumference of the Earth. That number, converted into modern units, comes to roughly 40,300 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth at the equator is about 40,075 kilometers, with nothing more than a stick, a well, and the power of careful reasoning. Eratosthenes had measured the size of our planet to within about 1% of its true value, more than 2,000 years before anyone would sail all the way around it. Can you sit with that for a moment? The quiet elegance of it. A man measuring the shadow of a stick, and from that single observation, calculating the size of the world. This achievement did not happen in isolation. It grew from a tradition of Greek geographical thinking that stretched back several centuries. The story begins with a thinker named Anaximander, who lived in the 6th century before the Common Era and is credited with drawing the first map of the known world. His map has not survived, but later writers describe it as showing the world as a flat, round disk with the sea at its center and the 3 known continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, arranged around it, all surrounded by a great encircling ocean. It was a bold act of imagination, the first known attempt to show the entire inhabited world on a single surface. A student of Anaximander improved the map a generation later, using information gathered from military campaigns and his own travels. And a generation after that, the historian Herodotus criticized it for being too neat, too symmetrical, pointing out that the real world was far messier and more complicated than any tidy circle could show. It was a surprisingly modern criticism. But the real revolution came when Greek thinkers realized that the Earth was not flat, but round. Philosophers observed that the Earth casts a circular shadow on the Moon during an eclipse, that different stars are visible at different latitudes, and that ships disappear hull first over the horizon, a simple observation that no flat world could explain. Once you know the world is curved, the challenge of drawing a map changes completely. It is one thing to sketch the coastlines of your known world on a flat surface when you believe the world itself is flat. It is quite another when you know the world is a sphere. A thinker named Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century before the Common Era, took a crucial step. He proposed that the globe should be divided into 360 degrees, borrowing the number system from the Babylonians, and that every place on Earth should have its position fixed by careful observation of the stars, not by guesswork or travelers' stories. This was the birth of latitude and longitude, the grid that covers the globe on every map you have ever seen. The great culmination of Greek mapmaking came with a scholar named Ptolemy, who worked in Alexandria around 150 years of the Common Era. Ptolemy wrote a book that would become one of the most influential works ever produced. Spread across 8 volumes, it was at once a guide to the theory of mapmaking, a list of coordinates for more than 8,000 locations across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and a set of instructions for how to flatten the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat page. Ptolemy also introduced the habit of placing north at the top of the map, something that seems natural to us today, but was entirely a matter of choice. Earlier maps had often placed east at the top, and many other traditions used different arrangements entirely. His decision would eventually become the global standard, one of the many ways Greek conventions shaped the maps we still use. But Ptolemy's great work also contained errors that would echo through the centuries. Most importantly, he used a smaller estimate of the Earth's size than the one Eratosthenes had calculated. This made the known world appear larger in relation to the whole globe, and it made the distance from Europe westward to Asia seem much shorter than it really was. More than 1,300 years later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus would rely on Ptolemy's too small Earth to argue that the Atlantic Ocean was narrow enough to cross by ship. That error led Columbus not to Asia but to the Americas, a discovery that changed the world and that rested in part on a mistake made in a library in Alexandria. Ptolemy's work was lost to Western Europe during the Middle Ages, but was preserved by Arab scholars who translated it and improved upon it. When it finally made its way back to Europe around the year 1400, it sparked a revolution in mapmaking that helped define an entire age. The Greeks did not merely make maps, they invented the entire way of thinking within which maps could be made as a science. They gave us the concepts of latitude and longitude, the understanding that the Earth is a sphere that can be measured, and the challenge of showing that sphere on a flat surface. Every map produced in the 2,000 years since Ptolemy is, in some way, an answer to questions that the Greeks were the first to ask. And now the story moves westward to a civilization that cared less about the shape of the world and more about the roads that crossed it. In the year 203 of the Common Era, workers in the heart of Rome began mounting enormous slabs of marble onto the interior wall of a great building. 150 slabs of gleaming white stone, each carefully carved with fine detail, were fitted together to form a single image measuring roughly 18 meters wide and 13 meters tall, about the size of a tennis court standing on its end. When finished, it was the largest and most detailed map the ancient world had ever seen, a complete plan of the city of Rome itself. At a scale that showed the ground plan of every structure in the city, this marble map depicted every temple, every public bath, every apartment building, every shop and staircase. Street names were carved into the stone beside the outlines of buildings. It was a monument to the precision of Roman government, a bold declaration that the empire knew its own capital down to the individual room, the individual step. That marble map survived intact for perhaps 2 centuries before the slow collapse of Roman civilization reduced it to rubble. During the medieval centuries, the precious marble was broken up for building material or burned to make lime. Over time, roughly 1,200 fragments have been recovered, representing only about 10 to 15% of the original surface. Modern researchers have tried to fit those fragments back together using computer programs that match the broken edges, like the most difficult jigsaw puzzle ever attempted. But the Romans were not, by nature, the same kind of map makers as the Greeks. Where the Greeks asked, "What shape is the earth?" the Romans asked, "How far is it from here to there?" Roman mapmaking was overwhelmingly practical, concerned with distances, routes, and the running of a vast empire connected by the finest road network the world had ever seen. At its height, the Roman road system stretched over 400,000 kilometers, reaching from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to the Persian Gulf. And the empire needed maps to manage every mile of it. The most remarkable Roman map to survive is an object unlike any map you have probably seen before. It is a strip of parchment over 6.5 meters long, but only about 34 centimeters high, showing the entire Roman world from Britain to India. This is called the Putinger Table, and it is one of the strangest and most wonderful maps in all of history. Because of its elongated shape, the map distorts everything severely. The Mediterranean looks like a thin sliver. Italy appears as a long ribbon. The whole world is squeezed vertically and stretched sideways. But this distortion is not a mistake. The Putinger Table was never meant to show what the world looks like from above. It was a road map, a guide to distances and routes, more like a modern transit diagram than a geographic map. What mattered was not the shape of the land, but the order of stops along the road and the distances between them. And in this respect, the map is wonderfully detailed. It shows roughly 550 cities and about 3,500 place names, all connected by a network of red lines representing roads. Distances between stops are carefully marked. Different symbols show different kinds of places. Spa towns get elaborate building symbols, harbors show small ships, granaries have their own distinctive markings, and road stations where travelers could rest and change horses are clearly indicated. It is, in a real sense, a travel guide to the entire Roman world. Imagine being a merchant in Roman times, planning a journey from the city of London to the holy city of Jerusalem. You could unroll this long strip of parchment and trace your route, stop by stop, knowing roughly how far each day's travel would be and what you might find at each resting place along the way. The map was named after a German scholar who inherited it from a poet who had discovered the manuscript in a monastery library in the 1490s. The copy that survives dates to around 1200, but it is believed to be based on a much older document from the 4th or 5th century, which may itself have come from a world map created during the reign of the first Roman emperor. It is now kept in a library in Vienna, and it was added to a special list of the world's most important documents in 2007. Beyond the Great Marble Plan and the road map, the Romans left their most lasting mark on the landscape itself when they conquered new territory. Roman surveyors would divide the land into a regular grid of plots using an instrument called a groma, a simple but clever tool made from a vertical pole with a crosspiece on top from which 4 weighted strings hung straight down. With this instrument, surveyors could lay out 2 perfectly straight lines crossing at right angles, and from those lines, they would divide the surrounding countryside into equal squares of farmland, each measuring about 710 meters on a side. These grids were imposed across vast stretches of the Roman world, from the fields of northern Italy to the plains of North Africa, from France to Croatia. And here is a lovely detail worth pausing on. These ancient patterns are still visible today. Modern photographs taken from aircraft and satellites reveal the straight lines and right angles of Roman planning, cutting through the natural curves of the landscape like a stamp pressed into wax. In some places, modern field boundaries, roads, and even property lines still follow the grid that Roman surveyors laid down more than 2,000 years ago. The Romans also created what may have been the first publicly displayed world map. Mounted on a wall in Rome, visible to any citizen who cared to look, it showed the entire known world. Although that map has not survived, we know from ancient writings that it was based on measurements taken from the road system. The public display of a world map was as much a political act as a cartographic one. It said to the people of Rome, "This is how much of the world we control." The Romans did not invent map making, and they did not push its theories forward the way the Greeks had. But they applied the idea of mapping to the running of an empire with an efficiency and scale the world had never seen. They mapped not to understand the world, but to control it, and in doing so, they created a model that every empire after them would try to follow. Now let us leave the roads of Rome and turn our attention to the open ocean, where a very different kind of mapping was taking place, one that required no pen, no paper, and no instruments of any kind. On the first day of May in 1976, a double-hulled canoe slipped away from a bay on the island of Maui and pointed its bow toward open ocean. On board were 16 crew members, provisions for a month at sea, and a quiet, powerfully built man from a tiny island in the Caroline Islands of the Western Pacific. His name was Mappae, and he carried no compass, no charts, no instruments of any kind. What he carried instead was a complete navigation system stored entirely in his memory, a system passed down through generations of master navigators, stretching back thousands of years. 34 days later, after covering roughly 2,400 miles of open Pacific, the canoe arrived at an island in the Tuamotu chain, from where it sailed on to Tahiti. 10,000 people lined the shore to welcome its arrival. The voyage had proved what many scholars had doubted, that the ancient Polynesian people had possessed the knowledge to cross vast stretches of open ocean deliberately, intentionally, and with precision. They had not drifted to their islands by accident. They had sailed there on purpose. The Polynesian achievement in navigation is arguably the greatest feat of human spatial knowledge in all of history. Over a period of roughly 3,000 years, Polynesian voyagers settled nearly every habitable island in a vast triangle of the Pacific Ocean, bounded by Hawaii to the north, Easter Island to the southeast, and New Zealand to the southwest. This area is roughly twice the size of the continental United States. And they achieved all of this without writing, without metal tools, and without any navigation device that a European would have recognized. The key to their navigation was what we might call a star compass, a mental tool rather than a physical one. The navigator divided the horizon into 32 positions, each one matching the rising or setting point of a particular star. By memorizing the positions of hundreds of stars and tracking their movement across the night sky, the navigator could hold a steady course across open water for days or even weeks at a time. On that famous 1976 voyage, Mappae used the stars as his primary guide, supplemented by careful observation of the sun, the moon, and the ocean swells. The training of a navigator like Mappae was an extraordinary process that began in childhood and could last 20 years or more. The studies included memorizing the rising and setting positions of more than 200 stars, learning the names and feel of dozens of different ocean swells, understanding the patterns of seasonal winds, and mastering the signs given by birds, clouds, the glow of certain sea creatures, and the color of the water. None of this was written down. Every piece of knowledge was passed from teacher to student by voice and by practice in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. But reading the stars was only part of the system. Polynesian navigators also read the ocean itself with extraordinary skill. They knew that island chains create predictable changes in the patterns of ocean swells, bending and shaping waves in ways that an experienced navigator could feel through the hull of a canoe. They could sense the presence of land far beyond the visible horizon by noticing subtle shifts in wave patterns, by watching the way clouds gathered over unseen islands, by following the paths of seabirds returning to their nesting grounds, and by spotting driftwood or certain kinds of sea life in the water. Can you imagine that for a moment? Lying in the bottom of a canoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, feeling the rhythm of the waves through the wooden hull, and from that rhythm alone knowing that land is near. Perhaps the most remarkable physical objects from this tradition are the stick charts of the Marshall Islands. These were made from the stiff central ribs of coconut palm leaves, lashed together with fiber, with small shells tied on to represent islands. The stick patterns did not show geography in the way we might expect. Instead, they showed the patterns of ocean swells and how those swells bent and changed around islands. Three kinds of stick charts existed, one showing the general wave pattern around a single island, another showing several islands within a chain, and a third showing an entire chain or pair of chains. Each chart was personal, unique to the person who made it, encoding that individual's own knowledge and experience. Western researchers who first encountered these objects often dismissed them as simple curiosities, unable to recognize the deep understanding of the ocean they contain. The charts were studied and memorized before a voyage, but were never actually brought along for the trip. The navigator carried the knowledge in memory and felt the information through the canoe itself. The success of that 1976 voyage sparked something far larger than a proof of concept. It helped set in motion what has been called a cultural rebirth across the Pacific, a revival of interest in traditional Polynesian culture, language, and knowledge that had been pushed aside during centuries of colonial rule. A young Hawaiian man named Nainoa Thompson learned the art of traditional navigation from Mappae, and in 1980 became the first Hawaiian in over 600 years to navigate between Hawaii and Tahiti using nothing but the old methods. Between 2014 and 2017, that same canoe completed a worldwide voyage, visiting 150 ports in 18 countries, carrying the message that traditional knowledge of the sea was not something belonging only to the past. Mappae, the quiet navigator who made it all possible, passed away in 2010 at the age of 78. He has been called the greatest navigator of the 20th century, and it would be difficult to argue otherwise. The Polynesian tradition reminds us of something easy to forget. Maps do not have to be drawn, printed, or displayed on screens. They can be sung, danced, felt through the hull of a canoe, or read in the movement of stars across the sky. The story of maps is not only the story of marks on paper, it is the story of every system humans have ever created to organize, remember, and share their knowledge of where things are. And now, Let us turn to a civilization that not only preserved the map-making knowledge of the ancient world, but quietly corrected it and made it better. In the year 833 of the Common Era, in the great city of Baghdad, a Persian mathematician completed a book that would reshape the world's understanding of geography. The book was a careful revision of Ptolemy's famous work, the guide to map-making that had dominated geographical thinking for 7 centuries. But this scholar did not simply copy what Ptolemy had written. He corrected it. Where Ptolemy had overestimated the length of the Mediterranean Sea, this mathematician brought the number closer to the true value. Where Ptolemy had shown the Indian and Atlantic Oceans as landlocked seas, surrounded entirely by land, the new book showed them as open bodies of water connected to the global ocean. And where Ptolemy had listed coordinates for thousands of places, this scholar updated and expanded the list to include some 2,400 cities and geographic features, drawing on the far wider knowledge of the Islamic world. His name was Al-Khwarizmi, and he worked in one of the most legendary centers of learning in all of history, a place called the House of Wisdom. This was not merely a library. It was a research center and a kind of translation factory where teams of scholars rendered the great works of Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost and making it available to a new generation of thinkers who would not merely store it away but improve upon it. Now, there is something worth pausing on here. The contribution of Islamic scholars to map-making is sometimes described as simple preservation, a kind of caretaking that kept Greek knowledge alive until Europe was ready to use it again. This view is deeply misleading. Islamic scholars did not merely translate Ptolemy. They tested his claims, found his mistakes, and created new works that in many ways surpassed anything the ancient Greeks had achieved. A school of geographers that arose in the 10th century developed its own approach to map-making, one that used only straight lines, right angles, and smooth curves to represent features of the world. These maps were not meant to show what the land looked like from above. They were designed to organize geographic information in a clear, useful way, more like a modern diagram than a picture of the Earth. They served the practical needs of merchants, travelers, and government officials moving through the vast Islamic world. But the greatest single achievement of Islamic map-making came from a most unlikely partnership. Around 1138, the King of Sicily, a Christian ruler of Norman origin, invited a Muslim geographer to his court. The king had heard of this man's extensive travels across North Africa and Europe, and he wanted him to create the most thorough and accurate description of the world ever produced. The geographer's name was Al-Idrisi, and the work he created after 15 years of careful research was one of the masterpieces of medieval map-making. It consisted of a book containing 70 detailed section maps organized by climate zones. The book was accompanied by an extraordinary physical object, a large silver disc weighing roughly 300 pounds, engraved with a map of the entire known world. Al-Idrisi's maps were drawn with south at the top and north at the bottom, following the convention of the Islamic map-making tradition. The work drew on ancient Greek geography, the reports of Arab and Persian travelers, and information gathered by the king's own envoys. The calculation of the Earth's circumference in this work came within 10% of the true value, a quietly impressive figure for the 12th century. The original silver disc was destroyed during a political uprising a few years after it was made. But Al-Idrisi had fled to North Africa carrying the Arabic version of the book, ensuring that the work survived to influence generations of scholars. Imagine the scene, if you will. A Muslim scholar and a Christian king, working together for 15 years on an island in the Mediterranean, combining knowledge from Greek, Arabic, and Latin sources to create the finest picture of the world that anyone had yet assembled. In a time often remembered for its religious conflicts, this collaboration stands as a quiet reminder that the pursuit of knowledge has always been able to cross the boundaries that politics and faith try to impose. Centuries later, the tradition of Islamic map-making reached the Ottoman Empire with remarkable results. In 1513, an Ottoman naval commander and cartographer completed a world map that would later become one of the most discussed documents in the history of maps. The surviving piece of his map, roughly 1/3 of the original, shows the western coasts of Europe and Africa, the coast of Brazil, and various islands in the Atlantic. What made it so remarkable was where its information came from. The cartographer had gathered his data from at least 20 different source maps, including ancient Greek ones, Portuguese charts, an Arabic map, and, most intriguingly, a chart believed to have been made by Christopher Columbus himself. The connection came through a Spanish sailor who had traveled with Columbus and who was later captured by the Ottoman cartographer's uncle. This map was rediscovered in 1929 during building work at a palace in Istanbul, and it generated enormous interest because it showed surprisingly detailed knowledge of the Americas at a very early date. It remains in that palace today, a reminder that the Ottoman Empire was a sophisticated cartographic power in its own right, able to draw together knowledge from Islamic, European, and ancient sources into a single view of the world. Beyond the famous names, the Islamic world produced an enormous body of practical mapping work. The annual pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, required of every Muslim who could afford the journey, generated detailed route maps describing the roads, water sources, and resting places between cities and the holy site. Arab and Persian merchants trading across the Indian Ocean developed navigation guides that recorded compass bearings, star positions, and coastal landmarks for voyages stretching from East Africa to China. The Islamic world's contribution to the history of maps is deep, rich, and too often overlooked. When Ptolemy's great work was reintroduced to Europe in the 1500s, sparking a revolution in map-making, it arrived not in its original Greek form, but bearing the corrections and additions that Islamic scholars had carefully made over 700 years. Without the House of Wisdom, without al-Khwarizmi and al-Idrisi, the story of maps in the West would have been very different indeed. And so let us cross now into medieval Europe, where maps were being made with a very different purpose in mind, not to show the traveler how to reach a distant city, but to show the soul how to reach heaven. In a cathedral in the west of England, behind a heavy door, hangs a single sheet of animal skin measuring about 5 feet by 4 feet. The surface is covered with hundreds of tiny drawings rendered in ink and colored paints. At first glance, it looks like a peculiar work of art, a densely packed picture crammed with images of cities, rivers, animals, scenes from the Bible, and strange creatures. But this is a map, and not just any map. It is the Hereford map of the world, the largest medieval map still known to exist, created around the year 1300. To a modern viewer, the Hereford map is bewildering. Jerusalem sits at the exact center of the world. East is at the top, not north. The Mediterranean is recognizable but oddly shaped. Africa and Asia are enormous. Europe is small, and the British Isles are squeezed into the bottom left corner as though they were an afterthought. Scattered across the map are drawings of the Tower of Babel, the Ship of Noah, the Great Maze of Crete, and the Pillars of Hercules. The Garden of Eden appears at the very top of the map, at the easternmost point of the world, enclosed by a ring of fire. And along the edges in the distant lands at the margins of the known world, strange beings populate the landscape, people without heads whose faces appear on their chests, people who shade themselves from the sun with a single enormous foot, people with the heads of dogs. For a long time, modern scholars looked at maps like this and shook their heads. They saw them as embarrassing failures, proof of how far European knowledge had fallen since the days of the ancient Greeks. How could the people of the 1300s have produced something so geographically wrong when Ptolemy, over 1,000 years earlier, had made maps of far greater accuracy? But this judgment misunderstands what these medieval maps were actually for. They were never meant to help anyone navigate. No sailor ever plotted a course using the Hereford map. They were not geographic documents in our modern sense. They were something closer to visual encyclopedias, grand pictures that organized all of human knowledge, history, and creation into a single image. Jerusalem was at the center not because people did not know it was not the geographic middle of the world, but because it was the spiritual center, the place where the most important events in Christian history had taken place. East was at the top because that was where the sun rose, where the Garden of Eden was believed to have been, and where Christ was expected to return. The strange creatures at the edges represented the unknown, the uncivilized, the places where the familiar shaded into mystery. The Hereford map contains roughly 500 drawings, including more than 400 cities and towns, 15 scenes from the Bible, 33 kinds of animals and plants, and 32 different peoples. It is a remarkable work of art and scholarship, a medieval attempt to show the whole of the world's knowledge on a single surface. The most common type of medieval European map was something much simpler, called a TO map. Imagine a circle divided into 3 sections by a T-shaped arrangement of water. Asia fills the top half of the circle, and Europe and Africa split the bottom half. The vertical stroke of the T is the Mediterranean Sea, and the horizontal stroke is formed by 2 rivers, the Nile and the Don. This arrangement mirrored the biblical story of the world being divided among the 3 sons of Noah after the Great Flood, Asia to one son, Europe to another, Africa to the third. These were not attempts at geographic accuracy. They were simple diagrams, visual reminders of the relationship between geography, scripture, and history. The largest map of this kind ever made was produced in a convent in northern Germany during the 1300s. It measured an extraordinary 3.5 meters on each side, more than twice the size of the Hereford map. This map went even further in blending the physical world with the sacred, depicting the world as the body of Christ himself, with his head at the top, his feet at the bottom, and his hands stretching out to the sides. The entire known world was literally contained within the body of the divine. It was a striking visual expression of the belief that the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate things, but one and the same. Sadly, the original was destroyed during bombing in the 1940s, though copies survive. The Hereford map itself nearly met a different kind of end. In 1988, facing serious money troubles, the cathedral considered selling the map at auction. The announcement caused an uproar across Britain, and a campaign eventually raised enough money to keep it in place. A new building was constructed to house it, and the map has been on display there ever since, safe and cared for. It is worth noting that not all map-making in the medieval period was purely spiritual. Monks and clergy who traveled between monasteries, pilgrims who walked to holy sites in Rome or the Holy Land, and merchants who traded across Europe all had practical geographic knowledge that they sometimes recorded in written lists of routes and distances. One Benedictine monk in the mid-1300s produced maps of Britain and travel guides from London to the Holy Land that showed a genuine interest in getting the geography right, even while decorating the margins with the spiritual imagery of his faith. There is something rather beautiful in the way these medieval maps understood the world. We tend to think of maps as tools for finding our way from one place to another, and that is certainly one thing maps can do. But the people who made the great maps of the Middle Ages believed that the most important journey was not a physical one. It was the journey of the soul from this world to the next. And so they made maps not of geography, but of meaning. By this measure, they were not failures at all. They were, in their own quiet way, masterpieces. And so the story takes a quiet turn now to the appearance of a very different kind of map, one drawn not from faith but from the hard-won experience of sailors who spent their lives on the water. Sometime around the year 1270, on board a ship somewhere off the coast of Italy, a navigator unrolled a chart unlike anything that had existed before. The chart was drawn on a single piece of sheepskin, with the natural point of the animal's neck forming one corner. Across its surface spread a remarkably accurate picture of the entire Mediterranean coastline. Networks of fine lines radiated outward from compass roses, crossing the sea in every direction like the threads of a spider's web. This was a Portolan chart, and its sudden appearance in the late 1200s remains one of the most curious puzzles in the history of mapmaking. The oldest Portolan chart still in existence dates to roughly 1270 and is now kept in a library in Paris. Its maker and its place of origin are unknown. The chart shows the entire Mediterranean and the Black Sea, along with a stretch of the Atlantic coast from Morocco to the Netherlands. And the coastlines it draws are rendered with an accuracy that scholars have found startling, precise to within roughly 20 miles in most places, a level of detail that seems almost too good for the tools available at the time. The puzzle of the Portolan charts lies exactly in this accuracy. They appeared suddenly, with no clear ancestors, and they were far more precise than any map produced by either the Greek or the medieval tradition. Some scholars have argued that they must be based on some lost body of knowledge, perhaps going all the way back to the ancient Phoenicians. Others believe they are simply the result of centuries of accumulated experience by Mediterranean sailors whose mental pictures of the coastlines they sailed every day were finally committed to parchment once a new tool became available. That new tool was the magnetic compass. Before the compass reached European sailors in the late 1100s, navigation in the Mediterranean relied mainly on landmarks, the position of the sun and stars, and sheer experience. With the compass, sailors could know their heading at any time, even in fog or under overcast skies, and could begin to plot courses as straight lines from one port to another. The crisscrossing lines on Portolan charts, radiating from compass roses, are the visual expression of this new way of navigating. A sailor could lay a straight edge from his current position to his destination, note where the line crossed the nearest set of radiating lines, rid off the compass direction, and set his course. Portolan charts were working documents meant to be used at sea. They were drawn on untreated sheepskin left in its natural shape, and they often show the wear of life aboard ship, water stains, creases, and patches where repairs have been made. The coastlines were drawn with great care, with special attention to harbors, capes, and dangers, while the interior of the land was usually left blank or filled with decoration. Place names were written at right angles to the coast, packed so tightly together that the sailor had to turn the chart to read them. Imagine holding one of these charts in your hands on the deck of a medieval trading ship. The smell of salt and tar in the air, the gentle roll of the hull beneath your feet and spread before you, a picture of the sea that is more accurate than anything your great-grandparents could have dreamed of. The most magnificent work in this tradition was not a simple sailing chart, but a full atlas. Created in 1375 by a Jewish book artist working on the island of Majorca, it stretched nearly 10 feet across 6 sheets of parchment mounted on wooden boards. This master mapmaker held knowledge of 3 languages and 3 cultural traditions, drawing on Christian, Jewish, and Islamic sources to create something truly remarkable. His atlas was a visual encyclopedia covering the known world from the Atlantic Ocean to China, from Scandinavia to the southern reaches of Africa. It combined the navigational accuracy of the Portolan tradition with the broad scope of the medieval world map tradition. One of its most famous images shows the emperor of the Mali Empire in West Africa, seated on a throne and holding a large nugget of gold. This was one of the first significant European images of the wealth and power of West African kingdoms, and it shows just how far the information networks of the medieval Mediterranean could reach. The atlas was probably made as a gift for a king, and it eventually found its way to France, where it remains today. It represents the high point of a school of map-making that flourished on Majorca for about 200 years, a unique place where Christian, Jewish, and Islamic learning met and blended. The Portolan tradition continued to develop through the 1400s, eventually merging with the new knowledge brought back by the Portuguese and Spanish voyages of exploration. Portuguese sailing charts incorporating the latest discoveries along the African coast became some of the most closely guarded secrets in Europe, a subject that would produce some of the most dramatic episodes of map theft and spying in history. But that is a story for a later chapter. The making of Portolan charts became a real industry in the coastal cities of the Mediterranean. Genoa, Venice, Mallorca, and Barcelona all developed their own schools of chart makers, each with a distinctive style that modern scholars can recognize. The charts were expensive, hand-drawn objects, and a ship's captain who owned a good one possessed something of real value. The government of Venice eventually required all its merchant ships to carry up-to-date charts, one of the earliest examples of a law requiring maps at sea. What the Portolan charts proved above all was that practical experience, the accumulated knowledge of working sailors who spent their lives on the water, could produce maps of extraordinary accuracy without any grand theory of latitude, longitude, or mathematical projection. The sailors of the medieval Mediterranean did not know the writings of Ptolemy or the mathematics of the Greeks. They simply knew their sea, and they drew what they knew. And now let us leave the familiar waters of the Mediterranean and travel eastward to a very different cartographic tradition, one that developed entirely on its own in a world the Europeans knew almost nothing about. In 1973, archaeologists excavating an ancient tomb near the city of Changsha in southern China discovered something remarkable among the burial goods. Alongside lacquerware, musical instruments, and the perfectly preserved body of a noblewoman who had died around 168 years before the Common Era, they found 3 maps drawn on silk, carefully folded and placed with the other treasures. When the silk was gently unfolded and studied, it revealed a map-making tradition of startling skill. One map showed the southern part of the kingdom in fine detail, with rivers, mountains, settlements, and military posts arranged across a square grid. The accuracy, when checked against modern maps of the same area, was quietly remarkable. These silk maps are among the oldest surviving Chinese map-making documents, but they represent a tradition that stretches back much further and that developed entirely apart from the Greek and Roman traditions of the West. Chinese map-making followed its own path, driven by its own needs, using its own methods, and producing works that were in many ways equal to or better than anything being made in Europe at the same time. The figure often called the father of scientific map-making in China was a government official named Pei Shu, who served under a new dynasty in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Around the year 271, Pei Shu set down 6 principles of mapmaking that would guide Chinese cartography for centuries to come. He insisted on the use of a consistent scale, on getting the directions right, on measuring actual distances along roads, on adjusting for differences in the height of the land, on calculating diagonal distances properly, and on converting the twists and turns of real paths into their equivalent straight line lengths. What is striking about these principles is how modern they sound. Scale, direction, distance, elevation, and the challenge of showing a 3-dimensional landscape on a flat surface. These are exactly the problems that mapmakers everywhere have always had to solve. Pei Shu tackled them with a clarity that would fit comfortably in any modern textbook on the subject. One of the finest achievements of Chinese mapmaking is a map carved into stone in the year 1137 during the Song dynasty. This map shows the coastline and river systems of China, with an accuracy that stunned modern scholars when they first compared it to current maps. A precise grid of squares covers the surface, each square representing a fixed distance, creating a coordinate system that allowed any location to be pinpointed with mathematical precision. The coastline, the courses of the great rivers, and the positions of hundreds of cities are all drawn with a fidelity that rivals maps made in Europe 600 years later. But perhaps the most astonishing map to come out of East Asia before the age of European exploration, was not Chinese at all. It was Korean. In 1402, two scholars working for the newly established Korean dynasty completed a world map that showed not just East Asia, but the whole known world, from Africa and Europe in the west to Japan in the east. This map, the oldest surviving Korean world map, is remarkable for what it includes. It was based on Chinese sources that had been enriched by the expanded geographic knowledge of the Mongol Empire, which had opened connections between China and the Islamic world and brought information about distant lands flowing eastward along the trade routes. The map shows a small but recognizable Africa, with its southern tip drawn with surprising accuracy. The Arabian Peninsula is visible. More than 100 European place names appear, and over 30 African place names can be read, including what scholars believe are labels for Cairo and the port city of Mogadishu. China sits at the center of this map, reflecting the view of the world that was common in the region at the time, and Korea is shown much larger than it really is. Japan appears in the wrong position, placed to the south rather than to the east. But the map's geographical reach is extraordinary, especially when you consider that it was made nearly a century before any European ship rounded the southern tip of Africa. The knowledge networks of the Mongol Empire and the Islamic world had already assembled a broad picture of the entire globe, and that knowledge had traveled all the way to Korea. The two surviving copies of this map are both in Japan, taken there during invasions of Korea in the late 1500s. They remain among the most important maps in Asian history, and they challenge the common belief that global geographic knowledge was something only Europeans possessed during the age of exploration. Meanwhile, the Ming dynasty was undertaking its own spectacular expansion of what was known about the world. Between 1405 and 1433, a great admiral named Zheng He led 7 massive naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean. His ships were the largest wooden vessels ever built, and his fleets included hundreds of vessels carrying tens of thousands of sailors. They reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the east coast of Africa. The navigation charts used by his fleet show detailed sailing routes with compass bearings, distances, and coastal outlines. Can you picture those enormous ships, each one larger than anything sailing in Europe at the time, crossing the Indian Ocean in great fleets, charting coastlines that no Chinese navigator had ever seen before? But in 1433, the Imperial court abruptly halted all overseas voyages. In the decades that followed, the building of large ships was banned and records of the journeys were deliberately destroyed. China turned inward, abandoning the maritime exploration that might have given it map-making dominance of the entire world. Within a few decades, Portuguese ships would begin their own voyages down the African coast, and the center of gravity in the story of maps would shift decisively to Europe, where it would remain for the next 5 centuries. The independent map-making traditions of China and Korea remind us that the history of maps is not a single story, but many stories, unfolding at the same time in different parts of the world, each with its own reasons, its own methods, and its own quietly remarkable achievements. And now let us widen our view still further to look at the many other ways that cultures across Asia and the Americas pictured their world. In a monastery in the deserts of Western India, painted on cloth with the careful precision of a devotional act, a circular diagram depicts the universe as one of the world's great religious traditions understands it. At the very center rises a mountain so vast that the highest peaks on Earth look like pebbles beside it. Radiating outward from this cosmic mountain in perfect rings lie the continents and oceans, one ring of land, then a ring of sea, then another continent, then another ocean, expanding outward in alternating circles until the very edges of existence are reached. Only the innermost lands are home to human beings. Everything beyond belongs to gods, spirits, and cosmic forces beyond our understanding. This is not a map in the way we usually think of the word. It makes no attempt to show the physical shape of the Earth as it would look from above. But in its own way, it is a deeply cartographic document, a picture of how reality itself is organized in space, as understood by a faith tradition stretching back thousands of years. Maps like these have been produced in India from at least the 1300s to the present day, and they carry forward a tradition of cosmic map-making that is older than anything in the European tradition. Across South Asia, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain thought all share the idea of a great mountain at the center of the universe, but each tradition depicts it differently. Buddhist world maps common throughout East and Southeast Asia show the mountain rising from a cosmic ocean, surrounded by continents and heavenly realms arranged according to Buddhist teaching. These were not maps for travelers. They were spiritual tools, helping people understand their place in the vast order of things and the path toward a higher understanding. Indian thinkers also made contributions to the more practical side of geography. Indian astronomers and mathematicians worked out careful calculations of latitude, measured the size of the Earth, and developed an understanding of how the heavens move that was drawn upon by Islamic scholars, and, through them, eventually reached the mapmakers of Europe. One astronomer, writing in the 500s of the Common Era, correctly proposed that the Earth spins on its own axis, and his estimate of its circumference was impressively close to the truth. But these mathematical achievements were not, for the most part, applied to the kind of geographic map-making that grew from the Greek tradition. The Indian genius for spatial thinking expressed itself in other forms. On the other side of the continent, Japan developed its own distinctive way of making maps, deeply shaped by Buddhist thought and by geographic ideas borrowed from China. The earliest Japanese maps are linked to a Buddhist priest who lived in the 700s of the Common Era. Although there is no proof this priest ever drew a map himself, his name became attached to a style of map that used simple loop shapes to show the boundaries of provinces. This style, with south often placed at the top, dominated Japanese map-making for centuries. From the 1300s onward, Japanese monks created hundreds of Buddhist world maps that placed India prominently as the birthplace of the Buddha, with China and Japan at the eastern edge of the known world. The great cosmic mountain stood at the center, and the arrangement of lands and seas followed Buddhist scripture rather than what anyone had actually observed. These maps were objects of faith, not tools for travel. But Japan's most remarkable map-making achievement came much later, and it is one of the most extraordinary individual efforts in the entire history of maps. A retired merchant, born in 1745, decided at the age of 55 to do something that no one in Japan had ever done before. He would walk the entire coastline of Japan and measure it as he went. Beginning in 1800, he spent 17 years on surveying expeditions, covering roughly 35,000 kilometers on foot. He used measuring chains, compass readings, and observations of the stars to create the first accurate map of the entire Japanese coast. His great map, published after his death, was so precise that when it was compared to maps made later with European instruments, the match was nearly perfect. Imagine a man of 55 setting out with his measuring tools, walking day after day along rocky shores and sandy beaches, through fishing villages and past towering cliffs, recording every bend and inlet of his nation's coastline. It took him 17 years. The result was a masterpiece. Far across the Pacific, in Mesoamerica, entirely different map-making traditions flourished. The Aztec civilization produced maps unlike anything in either the Eastern or Western tradition. Their map-making was pictographic, weaving together images of place, time, story, and meaning into single documents that told stories as much as they showed geography. One Aztec map created shortly after the Spanish conquest shows the capital city of the Aztec Empire divided into 4 sections by canals, mirroring the 4-part division of the universe in Aztec belief. At the center sits the eagle on a cactus, the founding symbol of the city. The original settlers are depicted around the sections, and the whole composition works as a map, a historical record, and a spiritual diagram all at once. Another Aztec document chronicles the legendary migration of the people from their mythical homeland to the site where they built their great city. It is a map of a journey through both space and time, blending geographic stopping points with historical events and religious symbolism in a way that no European map ever attempted. This was narrative map-making, and it shows that the impulse to represent where things are can take forms radically different from the grid-based north-at-the-top maps that the European tradition eventually made universal. The Spanish conquest of Mexico destroyed much of the Aztec map-making tradition. Indigenous practices were pushed aside and replaced by European methods. But enough survived, preserved in colonial-era copies, and in the work of indigenous mapmakers who adapted their skills to serve the new rulers, to give us a glimpse of a cartographic world that was as rich and as different as anything found on the other side of the ocean. All of these traditions, Indian, Japanese, Mesoamerican, share a common thread. They remind us that there is no single, natural, or inevitable way to make a map. The choices we take for granted today, north at the top, a grid of coordinates, geographic accuracy, valued above all else, are not universal truths. They are habits of one particular tradition, developed in one part of the world and later spread across the globe. And now the story returns to Europe, where an entirely new world was about to appear on the map, sending shockwaves through everything cartographers thought they knew. On a spring morning in the year 1500, in a small Spanish port, a man named Juan de la Cosa bent over a large piece of parchment and began to draw. De la Cosa was a sailor, a navigator, and a mapmaker, and he had been present at one of the most important moments in human history. He had owned the ship on which Christopher Columbus sailed when he first reached the Bahamas in October of 1492, and he had returned to the new lands on later voyages. Now working from his own observations and the reports of other explorers, he was creating a map of the world that included something no European map had ever shown: the coastline of the Americas. The map he made is the oldest surviving drawing of the New World. It is a large chart, roughly a meter tall and nearly 2 meters wide, drawn on joined sheets of parchment sewn onto canvas. The Old World section reflects what was known around 1488, while the New World section brings in discoveries made up to 1500. The New World portion is drawn at a larger scale than the rest, as though de la Cosa was unconsciously expanding the part of the map that carried the most exciting new knowledge. One detail is worth pausing on. De la Cosa drew Cuba as an island, directly contradicting Columbus, who had insisted during his second voyage that Cuba was a part of the mainland of Asia, and had even forced his crew to swear an oath to that effect. De la Cosa, who had seen Cuba with his own eyes, drew what he knew to be true rather than what his commander had declared. The map is still kept in a museum in Madrid, and it has been recognized as the first map of the New World. The appearance of the Americas on European maps was a shock that echoed through the entire 16th century. For over 1,000 years, European maps had shown only 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. The framework of Ptolemy, eagerly embraced by scholars of the time, depicted a world stretching from the Atlantic to China, with no room for another landmass in between. The existence of the Americas did not merely require drawing new coastlines on existing maps. It required rethinking the entire framework of geographic knowledge, questioning the authority of the ancient writers, and facing the humbling realization that the old authorities had been ignorant of nearly half the world. The response was a scramble of map-making. Between 1500 and 1510, European cartographers produced dozens of maps, trying to fit the new discoveries into their understanding. Each map struggled with the same question: what exactly had Columbus found? Was it Asia, as Columbus himself believed until the day he died? Was it a scattering of islands just off the Asian coast? Or was it something else entirely, a new continent that no ancient authority had ever mentioned. The answer came, at least on paper, on April 25, 1507, when a German mapmaker published a world map in a small town in the mountains of eastern France. This map was groundbreaking. It was the first to show the New World as a separate continent, entirely distinct from Asia, with a great ocean separating them. And in the southern portion of this new landmass, the mapmaker placed a single word that would change the world forever: America. The name honored an Italian explorer whose published accounts of voyages to the South American coast had persuaded the mapmaker that this was truly a new continent and not merely a piece of Asia. The mapmaker and a colleague published a small booklet alongside the map, arguing that the new land deserved a name, just as Europe and Asia had names. Roughly 1,000 copies of the map were printed, but for centuries, only one was known to survive. It was rediscovered in 1901 in a castle library in southern Germany. In 2003, it was purchased for $10 million, making it one of the most expensive documents ever sold. It is sometimes called the birth certificate of America. Here is an interesting twist. The mapmaker himself seems to have had second thoughts about the name. On a later map made in 1513, he removed the word America and replaced it with a label meaning unknown land. But by then, other mapmakers had already picked up the name, and it was too late to change it. A decision made in a small French town by a German scholar had permanently named 2 continents. Another map from this period reveals just how desperately European powers guarded the geographic knowledge flowing back from the New World. A Portuguese world map from 1502, which included the most secret navigational information about trade routes and newly charted coastlines, was stolen through an act of spying so dramatic that it deserves its own telling, and we will come to that shortly. It is now kept in a library in the Italian city of Modena, one of the earliest accurate pictures of the Brazilian coast and the dividing line that the Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn through the Atlantic in 1494, splitting the new lands between Portugal and Spain. The cartographic shock of the Americas did more than add new land to European maps. It destroyed the old order that those maps had represented. The authority of the ancient scholars, which had provided the intellectual framework for European mapmaking since the rediscovery of Ptolemy, was suddenly and permanently undermined. If Ptolemy could have been wrong about an entire half of the world, what else might he have been wrong about? This question opened the door to a new era of mapmaking based not on ancient books, but on direct observation, careful measurement, and the gathering of new information from every corner of the globe. The age of exploration was also the age when maps stopped looking backward to the ancient past and began looking forward to the modern world. And one mapmaker, more than any other, would come to define this new era, a man whose name became so closely linked with maps that it is almost impossible to say one without thinking of the other. In the winter of 1544, soldiers came for a young Flemish mapmaker. His name was Gerard de Cremer, though he had taken to using the Latin version of his name, which meant merchant, the name by which the world would come to know him. He was arrested on suspicion of holding beliefs that went against the teachings of the church. The charge was vague, but the danger was very real. The authorities were watching closely in the Low Countries, and the traveling this young man did for his geographic research had drawn unwanted attention. He spent several months in prison before being released, an experience that left deep marks on a man who would go on to create the most famous and most debated map in history. He was born in 1512 in a small Flemish town in what is now Belgium. After studying mathematics, geography, and astronomy at university, he developed his skills as an engraver and instrument maker, producing some of the finest globes and scientific tools of his day. In 1569, he published the work that would make his name immortal. It was a world map printed on 18 separate sheets, and it was groundbreaking not for what it showed, but for how it showed it. He had developed a new mathematical way of flattening the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat piece of paper, a method that solved a problem which had troubled navigators for centuries. The problem was this: on a round Earth, a line of constant compass bearing is actually a curving line that spirals toward the poles. But on this new map, those same compass lines appeared perfectly straight. A navigator could draw a straight line from his starting point to his destination, measure the angle against the compass lines, and sail that heading with confidence that it would take him where he wanted to go. For sailors crossing open ocean, this was a quiet revolution. The way the map achieved this involved stretching the distances between lines of latitude more and more as you moved away from the equator, so that the map's vertical stretching matched the horizontal stretching that comes from wrapping a round world onto a flat surface. The result was a map on which local shapes were preserved, but sizes became increasingly distorted at the higher latitudes. Greenland, which in reality is about 14 times smaller than Africa, appeared on this map to be roughly the same size. Europe and North America looked much larger relative to the regions near the equator than they actually are. It took time for the new projection to be widely adopted. The mathematical tables needed to draw it properly were not published by another scholar until 1599, and it was not until the 1700s that it became the standard for nautical charts. But once adopted, it proved remarkably durable. For more than 300 years, nearly every navigation chart in the world used this method, and it remains the standard for sea charts to this day. The same mapmaker also gave us the word atlas to describe a bound collection of maps, naming it after the figure from Greek mythology who was shown holding the heavens on his shoulders. His own great atlas was published by his son the year after his death. But the map also became the center of one of the most heated arguments in the history of cartography. In 1973, a German historian held a public event to denounce the projection as not just inaccurate, but deeply unfair. He argued that by making Europe and North America appear so much larger than Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, the map reinforced a view of the world that placed the wealthy nations at the center and made the rest of the world seem small and unimportant. He proposed an alternative that preserved the true relative sizes of continents, though it made their shapes look oddly stretched and distorted. The cartographic community was largely hostile to this alternative, not least because it was mathematically identical to a projection published by a Scottish minister more than a century earlier, a fact the critic had not acknowledged. Professional mapmakers pointed out that every flat map involves trade-offs between different types of distortion, and that the original projection had never been intended to compare the sizes of continents, but to help sailors cross the ocean. But the critic had touched a nerve. The argument he started forced a public reckoning with a truth that is easy to forget, that maps are never neutral. Every way of flattening the globe involves choices about what to preserve and what to distort, and those choices carry political weight whether the mapmaker intends it or not. In recent years, several cities began using the alternative projection in their public schools. The African Union backed a campaign to replace the traditional projection in international organizations. And a newer compromise projection, developed in 2017, has been proposed as a middle ground that preserves relative sizes while also looking pleasing to the eye. The man behind the original projection died in 1594 at the age of 82 in the German city of Duisburg. He could not have imagined that the method he developed to help sailors cross the sea would still be generating passionate political debate 5 centuries later. But perhaps that is the truest measure of what he accomplished. He created a map so influential, so widely used, and so deeply embedded in how the world sees itself that it became impossible to discuss it without also discussing the nature of power, perception, and the question of whose view of the world counts. And now, let us step into the shadows where maps were not just tools of knowledge, but weapons of statecraft, guarded more closely than gold. In the autumn of 1502, a man named Alberto Cantino boarded a ship in Lisbon, carrying something worth far more than its weight in gold. Hidden among his belongings was a large piece of parchment, a map showing the latest Portuguese discoveries along the coastlines of Africa, India, and the newly encountered land of Brazil. Cantino was not a map maker. He was a spy, an agent sent to the Portuguese court by the Duke of Ferrara, an Italian nobleman, with a single secret mission to obtain a copy of Portugal's most closely guarded state secret. Portugal maintained a master chart, a classified document kept at a government office in Lisbon where all the navigational information from Portuguese voyages was collected, updated, and carefully controlled. Access to this chart was restricted to the highest levels of government, and the penalties for sharing navigation secrets could include imprisonment or death. In an age when knowledge of newly discovered trade routes and coastlines meant real commercial and military power, maps were among the most valuable and most dangerous documents in existence. Cantino succeeded by bribing an unknown Portuguese map maker to create a copy of the classified chart. He paid 12 gold coins for the work, a considerable sum, and smuggled the map out of Portugal and back to Italy. The Duke displayed it proudly in his palace. The map showed remarkably accurate coastlines of Brazil, Africa, and the Indian Ocean, along with the dividing line that the Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn through the Atlantic. It survives today in a library in the Italian city of Modena, one of the most celebrated maps of the age of exploration. The Cantino theft was neither the first nor the last act of map spying in this era. Portugal and Spain both maintained elaborate systems for classifying and controlling geographic knowledge. Spain had its own government office in Seville that served a similar purpose, collecting information from every Spanish voyage and maintaining its own master chart. Navigators and ship captains were required to hand over their logs and charts when they returned to port, and unauthorized sharing of navigational information was treated as a serious crime. The Dutch, who were quickly rising as a sea power in the late 1500s and early 1600s, were especially determined to get hold of Portuguese mapping secrets. As the Dutch East India Company expanded its operations into the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, it needed the sailing charts that the Portuguese had spent a century creating. Dutch agents in Lisbon and other Portuguese ports actively worked to acquire, copy, or steal Portuguese charts, and several cases of cartographic espionage are documented in the records of both nations. The Dutch East India Company itself became one of the most secretive map-making organizations in history. The company maintained its own map office, which produced detailed navigation charts for company use only. These charts were classified, and ship captains were required to return them at the end of each voyage. The company also kept a secret atlas containing the most sensitive navigational information, and access to it was limited to the highest-ranking officers. The company understood that its charts were the foundation of its trading empire, and it guarded them accordingly. But the secrecy around maps was not only a European habit. China, during the Ming Dynasty, similarly restricted access to geographic and navigational knowledge. The charts used by the great Admiral Zheng He during his voyages in the early 1400s were closely held by the Imperial court, and when the government decided to end overseas exploration, records of the voyages were deliberately destroyed. The stakes of all this secrecy were not abstract. Maps represented power, wealth, and control over territory in the most direct way possible. A nation that knew where the spice-producing islands were, or where gold could be found along a distant coast, or where a navigable passage opened through unknown seas, could exploit those advantages and keep them from rivals. A nation that lost control of its maps could see its trade monopolies shattered and its colonies threatened. There is also an uncomfortable question buried in this story of secrets and stolen maps. The Portuguese and Spanish governments claimed sole ownership of the geographic knowledge their explorers had gathered, treating it as the property of the state. But the coastlines and sea routes they charted were not Portuguese or Spanish inventions. They were features of the natural world, known and sailed by local peoples for centuries or thousands of years before any European ship arrived. The idea that a European power could claim to have discovered a coastline that millions of people already knew about, charted in secret, and punish anyone who shared that knowledge, was an early version of the ownership disputes over knowledge that continue to shape our world today. The age of cartographic espionage reached its peak in the 1500s and 1600s, but the habit of treating maps as state secrets never fully went away. As we will explore in later chapters, the Soviet Union deliberately distorted its public maps for 50 years to prevent foreign intelligence services from using them. The United States developed spy satellites specifically to map Soviet military bases from orbit. And in our own time, the question of who controls geographic information and who has the right to see it remains as charged as it was when Cantino bribed a map maker in Lisbon more than 500 years ago. And now, let us lighten the mood and turn to the wonderful, strange creatures that once populated the edges of the world's maps, the sea monsters and the dragons, and the mysteries that lurked in every unknown corner. In the year 1539, a Swedish priest living in exile in Rome published the most spectacular map of Scandinavia the world had ever seen. The map was enormous, printed from 9 woodblocks, and it showed the geography and peoples of the Nordic countries in remarkable detail. But what made it famous was not its coastlines or its cities. It was the monsters. More than 20 sea creatures fill the waters surrounding Scandinavia on this map. Giant serpents coil through the Norwegian Sea, their bodies thick enough to wrap around a ship and drag it under. Enormous lobsters the size of small islands menace the coast of Norway. A whale so large that it looks like an island itself lies near Iceland, its back covered with trees, where sailors have supposedly gone ashore and built campfires, not realizing they were standing on a living creature. Animals with the heads of horses and the bodies of fish prowl near the Faroe Islands. And in the frozen north, on the land itself, a winged creature resembling a dragon stalks through the landscape. The mapmaker based his sea monsters on a combination of ancient writings, medieval animal books, and stories gathered from fishermen and sailors. Many of the creatures, as modern scholars have noted, appear to be wildly exaggerated versions of real marine animals, whales, walruses, giant squid, and large fish that would have been genuinely terrifying to anyone encountering them in the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. But others were born purely from imagination and hearsay, the kind of wonders and terrors that the unknown always seems to produce. Sea monsters on maps were not just decoration. They served several purposes at once. They warned sailors about dangerous waters where monsters, real or imagined, might be found. They filled the vast empty spaces of unexplored oceans, which mapmakers found both unattractive and commercially unacceptable, since a map covered with wonderful illustrations was more desirable and more expensive than one with blank stretches of empty sea. And they showed off the mapmaker's artistic skill and his knowledge of the scholarly and literary traditions from which many of the creatures were drawn. Now, here is a lovely detail worth knowing. The phrase, "Here be dragons," which has become perhaps the most famous saying associated with old maps, was in reality almost never used. The Latin version of the phrase appears on only 2 known historical objects, a small copper globe about 5 inches across, made between 1505 and 1510, and a closely related egg-shaped globe that may have been its mold. On the copper globe, the words are inscribed near the region of present-day Southeast Asia, and this is one of the only confirmed uses of the exact phrase in the entire history of mapmaking. That little globe is itself a remarkable thing. It is one of the oldest globes in existence and one of the oldest to show the Americas. It was purchased in Paris in the 1850s and eventually came to rest in a library in New York, where it remains today. but its most memorable feature is those three words in Latin, which have captured the imagination far beyond their actual historical importance. The tradition of filling maps with monsters goes all the way back to the ancient world and continued through the medieval period into the Renaissance. The great medieval map we explored earlier, the one in Hereford Cathedral, includes dozens of strange beings at the margins of the known world. Sailing charts often featured sea creatures in the spaces between coastlines. Even the grand atlases of the 1600s, produced by the finest printing houses in Amsterdam, included elaborate borders with mythological figures and exotic animals. But as geographic knowledge grew and the blank spaces on maps shrank, the monsters gradually disappeared. By the 1700s, serious scientific mapmakers had largely given up the custom of decorating their maps with imaginary creatures. The spirit of the age, which prized careful observation and rational thinking, left little room for sea serpents and dog-headed men. Maps became spare, technical, focused on conveying geographic information with precision rather than entertaining their viewers. The disappearance of monsters from maps is, in a way, a metaphor for a larger change in how we understand the world. Medieval maps tried to hold the whole of human knowledge, including its wonders, its terrors, and its spiritual meaning, all in one picture. Modern maps separate geographic information from everything else and present it in a clean, standardized format. Something was gained in this change: accuracy, clarity, usefulness. But something was also lost: the sense of wonder, the honest admission that there are places about which we know nothing and where, for all we know, strange things might still be found. The map, with all its sea monsters, nearly vanished from history itself. For centuries it was known only from later, simplified copies, and people assumed the original had been lost. Then, in 1886, one copy was found in a library in Germany, and in 1962 a second was discovered in Sweden. These two surviving copies, the only ones known from a print run that may have numbered only a few hundred, have allowed modern scholars to study this extraordinary creation in detail, admiring its monsters and appreciating the depth of knowledge, imagination, and artistry that went into one of the most remarkable maps ever printed. There is something comforting about those old maps with their monsters and their mysteries. They remind us that not knowing can be a kind of honesty, and that the blank spaces on a map can be just as meaningful as the filled ones. And now let us move forward to the golden age of printed maps, when a small country at the edge of the North Sea became the map-making capital of the entire world. On the 20th of May, 1570, a book appeared in the city of Antwerp that would change how the world looked at itself. Its author was a Flemish map collector who had spent years gathering, comparing, and studying maps from dozens of different map makers across Europe. The book was called The Theatre of the World, and it contained 70 maps printed on uniform sheets, each with descriptive text, all bound together in a single volume. By the agreement of most scholars, it was the first true modern atlas, though the word atlas would not be used for a collection of maps until another mapmaker coined it a quarter century later. What made the book special was not just its size, though that was impressive. It was the principle behind it. The author gathered the best available maps from 87 different mapmakers, and he did something that no one had done before in any systematic way. He gave them credit. At the front of the volume, he listed every cartographer whose work he had drawn upon, creating what was in effect the first bibliography in the history of mapmaking. In an era when mapmakers routinely copied one another without a word of acknowledgement, this insistence on giving credit was a quiet revolution in honesty. The book was also a great commercial success. It was designed not for sailors or soldiers, but for wealthy, educated readers who wanted to understand the world from the comfort of their libraries. The maps were beautifully engraved on copper, hand-colored by skilled artists, and bound in volumes that were as much works of art as reference tools. Demand was enormous, and by the time of the author's death, the book had gone through 25 editions in 7 languages. This same mapmaker made another observation that history would only fully appreciate centuries later. While studying his maps, he noticed that the coastlines of the Americas and the coastlines of Europe and Africa seemed to fit together like pieces of a broken plate. He suggested that the Americas had been torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods. This observation, made in the 1590s, came more than 300 years before a German scientist proposed the same idea formally, and it took until the 1960s for the scientific community to accept it. Antwerp, where this first atlas was made, was the intellectual capital of the southern Low Countries in the mid-1500s. But the city's fortunes were changing. War, religious persecution, and the fall of Antwerp to Spanish forces in 1585 drove thousands of skilled workers northward, many of them to Amsterdam. Among the crafts that migrated was map-making, and within a generation, Amsterdam had replaced Antwerp as the map-making capital of not just Europe, but the entire world. The engine behind Amsterdam's rise was the Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, one of the first great multinational trading companies. Its operations stretched from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to Japan, from the southern tip of Africa to the Caribbean. Every expedition that sailed from Amsterdam and returned brought new geographic information that had to be recorded, organized, and turned into maps and charts. The demand was constant and growing, and Amsterdam, with its busy port, its established printing industry, and its strong tradition of learning, was the perfect place to meet it. The family that came to dominate Amsterdam's map industry was the Bleyus. The father, born in 1571, had studied astronomy under one of the most celebrated scientists of the age in Denmark before setting up a printing and instrument business in Amsterdam. He began producing globes, wall maps, and sea charts, quickly earning a reputation for both accuracy and beauty. When the Dutch East India Company appointed him as its official map maker, it gave him access to the company's vast stores of navigational data and created something close to a monopoly on the production of official Dutch sailing charts. But it was the son who created the family's crowning glory. Between 1662 and 1665, he published what may be the grandest atlas ever produced. The complete edition ran to 11 large volumes containing roughly 600 maps and 3,000 pages of text. It was printed in 5 languages. The maps were engraved on copper with extraordinary precision, and the finest copies were colored by hand with pigments that included real gold. A complete hand-colored copy cost as much as a townhouse in Amsterdam, making it one of the most expensive books money could buy. It was a favorite gift of the Dutch government, presented to foreign kings and dignitaries as a statement of Dutch excellence. Imagine opening one of those volumes, the heavy cover giving way to reveal page after page of maps, so finely engraved and so richly colored that they seem to glow. Each map a small masterpiece, each one the product of years of data gathered by sailors and merchants from the farthest corners of the known world. The Bleyus faced fierce competition from rival publishing families who produced their own atlases. This rivalry drove constant improvement in quality and an ever-expanding range of maps. The Dutch East India Company itself maintained one of the most secretive map operations in history, producing classified charts that were never available to the public and keeping a secret atlas whose contents were restricted to the highest-ranking officers. The golden age of Dutch mapmaking came to a sudden end on a winter night in 1672 when a fire destroyed the Bleyus printing house in Amsterdam. The blaze consumed presses, copper plates, paper, and manuscripts that could never be replaced. The head of the family died the following year, and though the family's remaining materials were sold and scattered, the era they had defined was over. Yet the legacy lived on. The Dutch model of beautifully printed, scientifically grounded, commercially produced maps set the standard for all European mapmaking that followed. The idea of the atlas as a comprehensive, carefully organized collection of maps, first realized in Antwerp and perfected in Amsterdam, remains the basic format for geographic reference to this day. And now the story crosses the English Channel to France, where a single family would spend 4 generations trying to answer a deceptively simple question: how big is the kingdom, really? In the year 1682, a map was placed before King Louis XIV of France, and what it showed did not please him at all. The map depicted France, but it depicted a France that was noticeably smaller than anyone had previously believed. The western coastline had been pushed eastward, the southern coastline pulled northward, and the overall area of the kingdom had shrunk considerably. The king is said to have complained that the survey had cost him more territory than any of his enemies ever had. The map was the work of a newly founded scientific academy and its leading astronomer, an Italian-born genius who had been lured to Paris with generous promises. The survey's results were something of a humiliation for the Sun King, who had expected the project to celebrate the grandeur of his realm. Instead, he received proof that his realm was rather less grand than he had imagined. The story of this great survey begins not with maps, but with ambition. The king's finance minister understood that France's navy, its coastal defenses, its roads, and its tax collection all depended on accurate geographic knowledge, and France simply did not have any. The maps available to the government in the mid-1600s were wildly unreliable, based on travelers' guesses, rough compass readings, and errors inherited from earlier centuries. The minister wanted precision, and to get it, he founded a scientific academy in 1666 and recruited the finest minds in Europe. The chief recruit was an astronomer born in a small Italian town in 1625, who had already built a formidable reputation. Once installed at the new Paris Observatory, he turned his attention to the problem of mapping France with a precision that had never been attempted anywhere in the world. The method he used was called triangulation. The idea, first described in theory by a Dutch mathematician in 1533 but never applied on a national scale, was elegant. You measure a single straight line on the ground with extreme care. Then you use instruments to measure the angles from the ends of that line to visible points in the distance, creating a chain of interlocking triangles that can stretch across an entire country. From the angles and the known length of the first line, every other position in the network can be calculated with mathematical exactness. The first baseline was measured near Paris using precisely made iron rods laid end to end along the ground. The work was painstaking. Each rod had to be placed with care. The temperature accounted for, since metal expands and contracts with heat, and the terrain either leveled or compensated for. From this single measured line, the entire geometric skeleton of France would eventually be built. The astronomer began with the coastline, because the most urgent need was an accurate chart for naval planning. This coastal survey, completed in 1684, produced the map that so dismayed the king. The king's reaction, whether the exact words are true or not, captured a truth that would appear again and again in the history of maps. Accurate maps do not always tell people what they want to hear, and the power of a map lies not just in what it shows, but in what it proves. What makes this survey truly extraordinary is that it was not the work of one person or even one lifetime. It became a family mission spanning 4 generations and nearly 150 years. The first astronomer established the triangulation framework and the coastal survey. His son extended the network of triangles across the interior of France. His grandson undertook the enormous task of turning the geometric framework into a detailed map of the whole country. And his great-grandson saw the project through to completion during the upheavals of the French Revolution. The map that emerged from this multi-generational effort consisted of 182 sheets covering all of France at a consistent scale. It was the first topographic map of an entire nation produced through careful scientific measurement, and it set the standard that every later national mapping project would follow. The map showed not just coastlines and major cities, but roads, villages, forests, rivers, parish boundaries, and the shape of the land in a level of detail no previous map had achieved. Can you picture that dedication? A family devoting 4 generations to a single map, each father passing the work to his son, each son picking up where his father left off, measuring and drawing and calculating until the whole of France was captured on paper. The map also became an instrument of state power in ways its makers could not have expected. During the French Revolution, the new government seized the map as national property. Military planners used it during the wars that followed, recognizing that accurate cartographic knowledge was as valuable as any weapon. Napoleon himself was a devoted user of maps and is said to have carried a personal collection of these sheets on his campaigns. The influence of this survey spread far beyond France. It proved that a nation could be mapped with real scientific precision through a planned program of measurement. It inspired similar projects across Europe. The British survey that would become the Ordnance Survey, founded in 1791, explicitly followed the same approach. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, begun in 1802, applied the same principles to an entire subcontinent. The network of national mapping agencies that exists around the world today traces its origins directly or indirectly to the project that began in a field near Paris in the 1660s, where a man laid iron rods carefully on the ground and started measuring. There is also a lesson in the king's discomfort. The survey proved that France was smaller than believed, but the king was wise enough not to cancel the work. He understood that having an accurate map of his kingdom, even an unexpectedly smaller one, was better than having no accurate map at all. That lesson would be learned again and again. The value of a map lies not in whether it shows what the powerful want to see, but in whether it shows what is true. And now, let us turn to a problem that haunted navigation for centuries, a problem so difficult and so important that governments offered enormous prizes to anyone who could solve it: the problem of knowing how far east or west you are. On the evening of October 22nd, 1707, a fleet of Royal Navy warships approached the western entrance to the English Channel, returning home from a campaign in the Mediterranean. The Admiral, one of the most experienced naval commanders in Britain, had consulted with his navigators and believed his fleet to be safely west of an island off the coast of France, with a clear passage into the Channel ahead. He was wrong. The fleet was much farther north than anyone aboard believed, and at about 8 o'clock that evening, the flagship struck the rocks near the Isles of Scilly and sank in 3 to 4 minutes. All 800 men aboard died. 3 more ships also struck rocks and went down. Somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 sailors lost their lives that night in one of the worst naval disasters in British history. The Admiral's body washed ashore the following day. A local story, disputed but never quite forgotten, holds that he was still alive when he reached the beach, and that someone murdered him for the valuable ring on his finger. Whether true or not, the story captures the harshness of the era and the terrible human cost of a problem that had plagued sailors for centuries: the inability to determine how far east or west you are while at sea. The problem was easy to describe but maddeningly hard to solve. Figuring out your position north or south, your latitude, was relatively straightforward. You could measure the angle of the sun at noon or the height of the North Star, but figuring out your east-west position, your longitude, had no such simple trick. It required knowing the exact time difference between your current location and some fixed reference point, because the Earth turns 15 degrees of longitude every hour. If a sailor knew it was noon where he stood and could also know what time it was back in London, the difference in hours would tell him exactly how far east or west of London he was. The catch was that no clock in the early 1700s could keep reliable time on a ship at sea. The rolling, the salt spray, the changes in temperature, all conspired to throw off even the best timepieces of the day. The disaster at the Scilly Isles, combined with countless other navigational tragedies, finally pushed the British government to act. In 1714, Parliament passed a law offering a prize of £20,000, an enormous sum, for anyone who could find a practical way to determine longitude at sea within half a degree. A special board was created to evaluate proposals and award the prize. The law attracted a flood of suggestions, many of them wildly impractical. One proposed anchoring a chain of boats across the Atlantic and having them fire cannons at noon so that passing ships could set their clocks. Another suggested using a special powder that supposedly could heal wounds from a distance applied to a bandaged dog kept aboard each ship. Every day at noon, someone in London would treat the original bandage, supposedly causing the dog to yelp in pain, thus signaling the time. These were the desperate ideas of an age that had run out of conventional solutions. The person who actually solved the problem was among the least likely candidates. He was a self-taught clockmaker from Yorkshire, the son of a carpenter, with no university degree and no scientific credentials. He spent the better part of 43 years building a series of marine timekeepers, each one better than the last, each one designed to overcome the difficulties of keeping time on a moving ship. His first attempt was a massive, elaborate machine weighing about 75 pounds, full of interlocking gears and clever devices meant to compensate for the rolling of the ship and the changing temperature. It worked reasonably well, but was too big and complex for practical use. He followed it with two more large machines, each an improvement, but each still too bulky. Then, in an extraordinary leap of thinking, he abandoned the big machine approach entirely. His fourth attempt, finished in 1759, was a pocket watch about 5 inches across, a thing of exquisite miniature precision that bore almost no resemblance to its predecessors. This watch was tested on an 81-day voyage to the Caribbean, and when the ship arrived it had lost only 5 seconds. The law required accuracy to within 30 nautical miles. This tiny watch was accurate to roughly 1 mile, but the clockmaker's troubles were far from over. A rival scientist, who sat on the board that judged the competition, had developed a different method based on measuring the position of the moon and stars. This created a conflict of interest that the clockmaker and his supporters protested bitterly. The board kept demanding more tests, changing the rules, and delaying payment. The clockmaker received partial payments over the years, but was never formally awarded the full prize. It took the personal involvement of the king himself to settle the matter. The king, reportedly outraged by the unfair treatment, personally tested a 5th version of the watch and found it to be accurate to within 1/3 of a second per day. Parliament finally voted an additional payment to the clockmaker in 1773. He was 80 years old. He died 3 years later, having spent virtually his entire adult life on the problem of longitude. The marine clock eventually won out over the stargazing method, not because the astronomical approach lacked merit, but because a watch was simply easier to use than a long series of complex observations and calculations. By 1825, most Royal Navy ships carried these precision timekeepers, and the technology gradually spread to merchant vessels as well. The ability to determine longitude transformed not just navigation but map-making itself. With both latitude and longitude finally measurable at sea, the last great barrier to accurate maritime maps was removed, and the era of precise global cartography could begin. The human cost of the longitude problem across the centuries is impossible to calculate, but was certainly enormous. For hundreds of years, ships sailed with only a rough guess about their east-west position, and the result was a steady toll of wrecks, lost cargo, and drowned sailors. The solution, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a small, ticking watch made by a self-taught carpenter from Yorkshire, a man with no degree and no powerful friends. but with an obsessive determination to solve what the brightest minds of his age had called unsolvable. And now let us follow the maps out into the vast Pacific, where one man's voyages would fill in the last great blank spaces on European charts. On a clear morning in October of 1769, a boy stood on the eastern coast of New Zealand and watched a strange ship approach from the open sea. The ship was a converted coal carrier from northern England, and aboard her was a former farm labourer and coal ship apprentice named James Cook, who had been sent by the British government to observe a rare astronomical event from the island of Tahiti. He also carried sealed orders from the king, directing him, once the observations were complete, to sail south in search of the great southern continent that geographers had speculated about for centuries, the unknown southern land. What followed over the next decade would transform the map of the Pacific Ocean more completely than any single person had ever transformed the map of any ocean. Cook's 3 voyages, spanning from 1768 to 1779, filled in the last great blank spaces on European world maps, charted coastlines that no Western navigator had ever recorded, and set a standard of accuracy that would remain unsurpassed for more than a century. Cook had learned his craft in an unlikely school. Before joining the Royal Navy, he had spent years sailing coal ships along the coast of northeastern England. It was during his naval service that he first showed his remarkable talent for surveying. Between 1763 and 1767, he mapped the coastline of Newfoundland with such precision that the charts remained in active use for nearly 200 years. His first great voyage departed in August of 1768, carrying about 90 men, including a naturalist and an astronomer. After observing the astronomical event from Tahiti in June of 1769, Cook opened his sealed orders and sailed south. He reached New Zealand in October and spent the next 6 months sailing around both islands, producing the first thorough European map of the New Zealand coastline. The map was remarkably accurate, with only a couple of small errors. From New Zealand, Cook sailed west and in April of 1770 sighted the eastern coast of Australia. Over the following 4 months, he charted more than 2,000 miles of coastline, navigating the dangerous waters of the Great Barrier Reef and nearly losing his ship when it struck coral and had to be beached for repairs. The charts he produced of the Australian coast became the foundation for all later British exploration and settlement of the continent. Cook's second voyage carried a piece of technology that would change both navigation and map-making forever. A London watchmaker had built a copy of the famous marine clock that had solved the longitude problem, and Cook took it aboard his ship. For the first time in history, a navigator could determine his east-west position with real precision while at sea. Cook used the watch extensively, producing charts with a level of accuracy no earlier explorer had achieved. On this second voyage, Cook sailed farther south than any European had gone before, crossing into Antarctic waters 3 times and coming within 75 miles of the Antarctic coast without ever seeing land through the ice and fog. He proved that if a great southern continent existed, it was locked in ice and uninhabitable, putting to rest centuries of speculation. Along the way, he charted dozens of Pacific islands and added them to European maps for the first time. The third voyage took Cook into the North Pacific, searching for the long hypothesized sea passage between the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic. He mapped the Hawaiian Islands, explored the coast of Alaska, and was turned back by ice in the waters between Alaska and Russia. On the return voyage, Cook was killed in February of 1779 in Hawaii in a violent confrontation that began over the theft of a small boat. His death at the age of 50 cut short one of the most productive careers in the history of exploration and map-making. The charts he produced during his 3 voyages remained in use well into the 1800s. His map of the New Zealand coastline was still being consulted by the Navy there as late as the 1990s. But there is a deep tension at the heart of Cook's story that deserves a quiet moment of reflection. The Pacific Ocean that Cook charted as if it were a blank page was not blank at all. It was home to peoples who had navigated its waters for thousands of years, whose knowledge of its islands, currents, winds, and seasons was in many ways richer than anything Cook possessed. The Polynesian navigators we explored in an earlier chapter had crossed the Pacific centuries before Cook was born, using methods of star reading, wave reading, and oral tradition that European science was only beginning to appreciate. When Cook's maps placed European names on islands that already had names, European coordinates on waters that were already known, and European flags on shores that were already home to living civilizations, he was not discovering the Pacific. He was folding it into a European system of knowledge that would serve as the foundation for colonial expansion across the region for the next 2 centuries. The maps Cook produced were genuine achievements of skill, courage, and careful observation. They were also instruments of empire, drawn in the service of a European power that would use them to claim authority over peoples and places that had never asked to be claimed. This double character, cartographic achievement and colonial appropriation woven together, is one of the central tensions of the entire history of maps, and that tension would only deepen in the century that followed as European empires used maps not just to explore the world, but to divide it among themselves. On a November afternoon in 1884, representatives of 14 nations gathered around a long table in a grand room in Berlin. Before them lay a map of Africa, and over the next 3 months they would proceed to divide it up. The gathering, called by the German Chancellor, brought together diplomats from across Europe and from the United States. Not a single African nation was invited. Not a single African voice was heard. The continent's future was decided by men who, in many cases, had never set foot on African soil, and whose knowledge of African geography came almost entirely from maps that were themselves products of European exploration and assumption. The borders that emerged from this conference and the decades of colonial carving that followed were drawn with a cartographic bluntness that ignored geography, culture, and basic common sense. Roughly 44% of the borders drawn across Africa follow perfectly straight lines, tracing lines of latitude and longitude rather than any natural feature of the landscape. A British Prime Minister later observed with dry understatement that the European powers had been giving away mountains, rivers, and lakes to each other, hindered only by the small problem that they never knew exactly where those features were. These arbitrary lines cut through roughly 190 cultural groups, splitting communities between different colonial rulers, forcing traditional rivals into the same territories, and creating borders that had no relationship to the lives of the people who actually lived on the land. The consequences of those lines, drawn by men with maps and rulers in a conference room in Berlin, continue to shape the political geography of Africa today. The Berlin Conference was the most dramatic example of maps being used as tools of colonial power, but it was far from the only one. Across the world, European empires used maps to claim, organize, and control territories they had taken or were in the process of taking. The very act of mapping was itself a statement of authority. To survey a territory, to measure it, to give it coordinates and place names and borders, was to declare ownership over it in the most fundamental way. In India, the Great Trigonometrical Survey, which began in 1802 under the British, was a real scientific achievement, mapping the subcontinent with a precision never before seen. But it was also an instrument of colonial government, producing the detailed geographic knowledge that the British needed to govern, tax, and militarily control a territory of hundreds of millions of people. The act of placing a grid of survey stations across India was a statement of British authority over the landscape, a declaration that this land had been measured, catalogued, and absorbed into the machinery of empire. The most damaging form of colonial mapping may have been the quietest, the systematic erasure of indigenous knowledge. When European mapmakers placed their own names on features that already had names, they did more than swap one label for another. They declared that the existing names, and by extension the existing relationships between people and the land, simply did not count. Across the Americas, indigenous place names were replaced with European ones. In Australia, names given to features over 40,000 years were overwritten with the names of British officials and members of the royal family. In New Zealand, many traditional names survived but were often changed beyond recognition. The idea of empty land, the legal fiction that a territory belonged to no one before Europeans arrived, was at its heart a cartographic argument. If a place appeared empty on a European map, if it showed no cities, no roads, no borders that a European mapmaker would recognize, then it could be treated as ownerless, available for the taking. The fact that these places were home to peoples with their own knowledge, their own boundaries, their own ways of understanding the land, was simply invisible to the colonial map-making project. The map said the land was empty, and the map was the authority. This use of maps as instruments of power was not limited to Africa or the Americas. In the Middle East, two diplomats from Britain and France secretly drew a line on a map in 1916, dividing the lands of the Ottoman Empire between their two countries. The line ran roughly from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of Persia, separating what would become British and French territories. The consequences of that single line, drawn by two men with a map and a pencil, continue to reverberate through the politics of the Middle East to this day. But the story of colonial mapping is not simply one of European power and indigenous erasure. In many places, indigenous peoples found ways to use cartographic tools to push back against colonial claims. In 1976, Inuit communities across the Canadian Arctic documented their traditional land use through maps, creating one of the first major projects of what is now called countermapping, the use of map methods to challenge dominant stories and assert the rights of the people who actually live on the land. Similar projects have since been carried out by communities across every inhabited continent, using everything from handheld satellite receivers to drones to create maps that tell their own stories rather than the stories of distant governments. The movement to undo the cartographic damage of the colonial era is growing. Communities across Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific are working to restore traditional place names, draw traditional boundaries, and create maps that reflect the way indigenous peoples understand their own land. These efforts remind us that the colonial era did not merely draw lines on maps. It drew lines through cultures, through communities, and through ways of knowing the world. And the work of healing that damage, of reclaiming the right to name and map one's own land, is not just a technical exercise. It is an act of cultural and political self-determination. And now, let us turn to a very different kind of map, one that did not chart coastlines or borders, but instead tracked the invisible paths of disease through the streets of a great city. In the last days of August 1854, people in a neighborhood of London called Soho began dying with terrifying speed. The disease was cholera, and it moved through the crowded streets with a ferocity that turned healthy adults into corpses within hours. Victims suffered violent sickness, their skin turned blue from loss of water, and death could come within 12 hours of the first symptoms. In the first 10 days of the outbreak, more than 500 people in a small area around one particular street were dead. Families fled their homes, shops were closed, and the streets emptied as the neighborhood was consumed by fear. The medical experts of the day believed that cholera was caused by foul-smelling air, the stench that rose from rotting waste, open sewers, and the general filth of London's overcrowded neighborhoods. This theory had been accepted for centuries and seemed to make obvious sense, since the neighborhoods hit hardest by cholera were also the ones that smelled the worst. But a physician named John Snow, who had been studying cholera outbreaks for years, believed the medical establishment was wrong. Snow was convinced that cholera spread not through the air, but through contaminated water, and this particular outbreak gave him the chance to prove it. Snow's method was deceptively simple. He obtained a list of cholera deaths from the official records and began plotting them on a map of the Soho neighborhood, marking each death with a small black bar at the address where it had occurred. As the marks built up, a pattern emerged that was impossible to miss. The deaths were overwhelmingly clustered around a single point, the water pump on Broad Street. Houses closest to the pump had the highest death rates. Houses farther away had fewer deaths. And houses served by a different water source, even those just a few streets away, had almost no deaths at all. Snow then investigated the cases that seemed to contradict his idea. A workhouse very near the pump had remarkably few cases, but Snow discovered that the workhouse had its own private well and did not use the street pump at all. A brewery on the same street also had very few deaths, and Snow learned that its workers drank mostly beer rather than water, and that the brewery had its own well too. Most strikingly, Snow traced one death all the way to a distant part of London, far from Soho, where a woman who had once lived near the pump had water from it specially delivered to her home because she liked the taste. Armed with this evidence, Snow went before the local parish board in early September and persuaded them to remove the handle from the pump, making it impossible for anyone to draw water from it. The outbreak was already beginning to ease by then, and some historians have questioned whether the pump handle removal was truly what ended it. But Snow's broader research, comparing cholera rates among customers of two different water companies serving the same neighborhoods of London, provided overwhelming proof that contaminated water was carrying the disease. The map that Snow created, which was actually drawn by another hand and published in Snow's report the following year, has become one of the most famous maps in the history of science. It is often called the founding document of a whole new kind of mapping, the use of spatial analysis to understand the patterns of disease. But Snow's map was also something more basic than that. It was one of the earliest clear demonstrations that maps could be used not just to show where things are, but to help figure out why things happen, to reveal patterns that would be invisible without the view from above that a map provides. Snow was not the only pioneer of this new way of using maps. Around the same time, a nurse named Florence Nightingale created visual diagrams showing the causes of death among soldiers in the Crimean War, a form of presenting information through pictures that shared the same spirit as Snow's work. And in 1869, a retired French engineer, at the age of 80, created what many consider to be the finest statistical picture ever drawn. This engineer's map depicted a military disaster, the invasion of Russia in 1812. On a single sheet of paper, it showed 6 different kinds of information at once: the number of soldiers, the distance they traveled, the temperature, their location, the direction they were moving, and the dates. A thick tan band enters Russia from the left, representing an army of more than 400,000 men. The band narrows as the army advances, men dying of heat, hunger, disease, and fighting with every passing mile. At Moscow, the band turns black and begins its retreat, growing thinner with each step as the Russian winter closes in. Along the bottom of the page, a line chart shows the devastating cold, reaching nearly 50 degrees below freezing. By the time the black band reaches the western border of Russia, it is a thin, barely visible thread representing roughly 10,000 survivors. Can you picture that image? A thick river of color slowly thinning to a thread, 400,000 lives reduced to a whisper of ink on paper. One scholar of information design called it perhaps the finest statistical graphic ever drawn. It tells a story of unimaginable suffering in a single image without a single word of narrative. The map itself is the story. Snow's cholera map and that devastating picture of an army's destruction represent a turning point in the history of maps. For thousands of years, maps had been used to show where things are: coastlines, mountains, cities, roads. These new maps showed something different. They showed what happens and why. They proved that looking at information through the lens of geography could reveal causes and patterns that no list of numbers could make visible. Every map tracking the spread of an illness, every heat map of crime rates used by police, every election results map shown on a television broadcast traces its ancestry back to the simple act of a London doctor marking deaths on a street map of Soho in the autumn of 1854. The pump itself became an unlikely monument. The original was removed long ago, but a replica stands today on the street, now renamed, near a pub named after the doctor. Inside, a glass case displays a copy of the famous map, still showing its pattern of death and water to anyone who pauses to look. And now let us travel to India, where the largest survey in history was about to measure a continent and, almost by accident, named the tallest mountain on Earth. In the year 1802, a British military officer unpacked a massive brass instrument from its wooden crate on the coast of southern India near the city of Madras and began to measure. The instrument was a theodolite and it weighed roughly half a ton. Moving it across the Indian landscape would require a team of 12 men carrying it on a specially built frame, hauling it through jungles where tigers prowled, across rivers swollen by monsoon rains, and up mountainsides where the paths crumbled beneath their feet. The officer intended to use this instrument to measure the entire Indian subcontinent with scientific precision. The project he started that year would take 7 decades to complete and would become one of the greatest feats of surveying in the history of maps. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, as it came to be known, used the same triangulation methods that the Cassini family had used to map France, but on a vastly larger and more punishing scale. India's terrain included tropical coastlines, impenetrable forests, scorching deserts, vast plains, and the highest mountains on Earth. The climate ranged from suffocating humidity to bone-cracking cold, and the diseases of the subcontinent, malaria especially, would kill or disable dozens of surveyors over the course of the project. The first baseline was measured near Madras using a chain laid along the ground with extraordinary care, accounting for the way metal stretches in the heat and sags under its own weight. From this starting line, a chain of triangles began to grow, extending south and then north, gradually building a geometric framework across the subcontinent. The work was slow, dangerous, and often deadly. Survey teams might spend weeks cutting through jungle to reach a hilltop observation point, only to find that clouds or haze made the required measurements impossible, forcing them to camp and wait for days or weeks until conditions cleared. The officer who started the survey died in 1823, still working in the field after 21 years on the project. His successor was a man whose fierce dedication to precision would make the survey both legendary and controversial. This new leader, who became the chief surveyor of India in 1830, demanded the highest possible standards. He required multiple measurements at every station and refused to accept results that did not meet his exacting requirements. He drove his teams relentlessly, argued with nearly everyone he worked with, and suffered from chronic poor health that would have sent most people home years earlier. But under his leadership, the survey achieved a level of accuracy that astonished scientists around the world. In 1856, 3 years after this driven leader had retired, the survey produced its most famous result. A team of mathematicians at the survey's office calculated that a peak in the Himalayas, known to them only by its survey designation, Peak 15, was 29,002 feet above sea level, making it the highest point on Earth. The survey's superintendent proposed naming it after his predecessor. The man himself objected, pointing out that his name could not be written in the local languages or pronounced by the local people. But the name stuck, and the mountain that the Tibetans called Chomolungma and the Nepalis called Sagarmatha became known to the world by the name of a British surveyor who never saw it and never wanted it named after him. The measurement of 29,002 feet was remarkably close to the modern figure of 29,032 feet, an error of just 30 feet measured from a station more than 150 miles away. Perhaps the most remarkable chapter of the survey involved a group of secret agents, Indian men trained by the British, to carry out hidden surveys in regions where Europeans were forbidden to travel. Tibet was entirely closed to foreigners, and the British were desperate for geographic knowledge of the vast territory beyond the Himalayas. The solution was clever and troubling in equal measure. Indian men, often chosen from the hill communities near the mountains, were taught surveying skills and sent into Tibet, disguised as Buddhist pilgrims or traders. The most famous of them was a school teacher from a village in the foothills. In 1865, he set out on his first expedition disguised as a monk. He carried a prayer necklace modified to contain exactly 100 beads instead of the usual 108. As he walked, he moved one bead for every 100 paces, counting the distance he traveled. He had trained himself to keep a stride of exactly 33 inches over every kind of ground, flat or steep, rocky or snowy. His notes were written on thin slips of paper hidden inside a hollow prayer wheel. The mercury and thermometer he needed to measure altitude were concealed in a hollowed-out walking stick. Can you picture this man? Walking alone through the mountain passes of Tibet in the disguise of a monk, counting his steps, hiding his instruments, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or death. He reached the Tibetan capital in January of 1866 and spent 3 months there, secretly measuring the city's position and estimating its height above sea level. His estimate of the altitude was impressively close to the true figure. He was later awarded the highest honor of the Royal Geographical Society for his extraordinary journeys. Other secret surveyors followed him, some spending years in Tibet and China, covering thousands of miles on foot, while quietly recording the shape of the land. Many of them operated at enormous personal risk. If caught, they faced prison, torture, or death. These secret agents are among the most remarkable and most morally complicated figures in the story of maps. They were brave, resourceful, and extraordinarily skilled. They were also tools of colonial intelligence, employed by a foreign power to map a country without its knowledge or consent. Their work fed into a larger project of imperial control that would extend British influence deep into Central Asia. The Great Trigonometrical Survey was completed in the 1870s, having mapped the entire Indian subcontinent from its southern tip to the peaks of the Himalayas. It remains one of the most ambitious surveying projects ever attempted, a monument to both the scientific ambition and the colonial purposes of the British Empire. And now, let us consider a quieter revolution, one that changed not what maps showed from above, but how they showed the shape of the land rising and falling beneath our feet. In 1584, a Dutch surveyor stood on the banks of a river near the city of Haarlem and drew something that no mapmaker had ever drawn before. He drew a line connecting points of equal depth in the river. The line did not represent anything you could see or touch. It was an idea made visible, a mathematical way of showing where the riverbed lay at the same depth below the surface. That surveyor could not have known it. But this simple innovation, this invisible line drawn across the bottom of a Dutch river, would eventually transform how every map on Earth shows the shape of the land. For most of its history, mapmaking had been essentially flat. Maps showed the world as if seen from directly above, depicting coastlines, rivers, roads, and cities, but offering no reliable way to show the most obvious feature of any landscape, its height. Mountains appeared on maps as small sketched bumps like sugar lumps arranged along mountain ranges, with no way to tell how tall they actually were. Valleys and plains were simply blank space between features. A flat coastal marsh and a towering alpine valley looked essentially the same. The problem was simple to state but hard to solve. How do you show a three-dimensional world on a flat piece of paper? Artists had long used shading and perspective to suggest the feel of hilly country, but these were impressions rather than measurements. They conveyed a general mood of mountainous terrain, but could not tell a military commander the exact height of a ridge, an engineer the precise slope of a planned road, or a sailor the depth of water beneath his ship. The solution came gradually, through the work of many people over more than 2 centuries. After that Dutch surveyor's pioneering underwater line in 1584, the astronomer who predicted the return of a famous comet published a chart in 1701 that used lines to connect points of equal compass variation across the Atlantic Ocean. These were not depth lines, but they demonstrated the principle that invisible quantities could be made visible by connecting equal values. In 1729, another Dutch engineer produced what may be the first truly scientific map of underwater terrain, showing the bottom of a river mouth with lines drawn at regular depth intervals. This showed clearly that the technique could produce a readable, useful picture of a surface you could not actually see. A French mapmaker working in the mid-1700s expanded the idea further, producing maps of the English Channel that showed underwater depth lines and proposing that the same technique could be applied to mountains using lines of equal height above sea level. His work inspired a generation of French mapmakers who began experimenting with these lines on land. A turning point came in 1778 when an English mathematician used lines of equal height to map the shape of a mountain in Scotland, not for navigational purposes, but for a scientific experiment involving gravity. His mountain map was drawn for purely scientific reasons, but it showed the power and versatility of the technique in a way that caught the attention of the wider mapmaking community. Before these contour lines became standard, mapmakers used an older method called hatchering to suggest the shape of the terrain. Hashes were short, thick strokes drawn in the direction water would flow down a slope, with thicker or closer lines indicating steeper ground. The technique could produce beautiful atmospheric maps that gave a vivid feeling of mountainous country, but it had real drawbacks. It was subjective, hard to read with precision, and could not communicate exact heights. You could tell that a slope was steep, but not whether a hilltop was 500 meters or 1,000 meters above sea level. The military was the driving force behind the adoption of contour lines as the standard way to show terrain. Artillery officers needed to know the exact height of hills and the precise angle of slopes to aim their guns properly. Defensive planners needed to find the hidden ground behind ridges where troops could move unseen. Engineers needed to calculate the grade of roads and railways. All of these needs demanded a way of showing height that was precise, based on numbers, and left no room for guesswork. By the mid-1800s, contour lines had become the standard method for showing terrain on maps produced by national mapping agencies across Europe. The idea of fixed intervals between lines, say 10 meters or 20 meters of height between each one, made it possible for any trained reader to determine the elevation and slope of any point on a map with real accuracy. Imagine looking at a hiking map today. Those thin brown lines curving across the page, bunching together where the ground is steep and spreading apart where it is gentle, are the direct descendants of that first line drawn on a Dutch riverbed more than 400 years ago. Each line represents a fixed height above sea level, and together they paint a picture of the land's shape that is both mathematically precise and visually intuitive. The contour revolution was the moment when maps finally gained the ability to show the world in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. It solved a problem that had existed since the first mapmaker looked at a mountain and wondered how to draw it. It transformed mapmaking from a discipline concerned only with where things are on a flat surface into one that could capture the full rising and falling shape of the Earth. Every hiking map you have ever used, every nautical chart showing the depth of the ocean, every geological survey, every flight planning chart owes its ability to show the shape of the land or the depth of the sea to this principle. There is something satisfying about how quietly the idea arrived. A surveyor standing beside a river, drawing a line that no one else had thought to draw. Sometimes the simplest ideas are the ones that change everything. And now, let us dive beneath the surface of the ocean itself to a story of a woman who mapped a world she was never allowed to visit. In the autumn of 1952, a young geologist named Marie Tharp sat at a drafting table in a basement office at a university research center in New York and began doing something that no one had ever done before. She was drawing a map of the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Spread before her were long strips of paper covered with jagged lines, the readings from instruments aboard ships that had crossed the Atlantic, measuring the depth of the ocean floor. Each strip was a single line of depth readings, taken as a ship sailed from one side to the other. Tharp's job was to take these individual strips, align them with their correct positions, and build from them a picture of what the ocean floor actually looked like. Tharp could not do this work at sea. She was a woman, and in the 1950s, women were not allowed aboard the research vessels. The rule was not unusual for the time, but it was no less frustrating for being common. Tharp had earned her degree in geology only because the geology department had begun accepting women during the war, when most of the men were away fighting. She had joined the research center in 1948 and had been paired with a marine geologist named Bruce Heezen, who spent months at sea collecting data and then brought it back to Tharp for analysis. Working with pens, ink, and rulers, Tharp aligned the depth readings and began to build a picture of the great underwater mountain range that runs down the center of the Atlantic, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. As she plotted one set of readings after another, she noticed something striking. Near the top of the ridge, every set of readings showed the same thing: a distinct notch, a deep cleft or valley running along the very crest of the mountains. Tharp believed this notch was a continuous rift, a crack in the Earth's crust where the ocean floor was literally pulling apart. When she showed her findings to Heezen, his reaction was dismissive. He called it girl talk, a phrase that carried all the condescension it implies. The idea of a rift valley splitting the ocean floor was uncomfortably close to the theory that the continents move, an idea that had been proposed decades earlier by a German scientist and that most geologists in America at the time considered little better than a fantasy. Heezen rejected the theory of moving continents, and Tharp's rift suggested exactly the kind of crustal movement that the theory required. But Tharp was right. When Heezen plotted the locations of Atlantic earthquakes on a map, they fell precisely along the line of Tharp's Rift Valley. The match was too exact to be coincidence. Heezen had to reconsider, and by the mid-1950s, he and Tharp began working together on the first comprehensive map of the North Atlantic Ocean floor, published in 1957. The map showed something astonishing, something no one had expected. The ocean floor was not the flat, featureless plain that scientists had long assumed. It was a landscape as dramatic as any continent, with towering mountain ranges, deep trenches, vast plains, and the long, winding rift valley that Tharp had found running down the center of the mid-Atlantic ridge. Can you picture it? A world hidden beneath miles of black water, a world of mountains taller than any on land, and canyons deeper than any visible valley, all of it invisible, all of it unknown, until one woman sat at a desk and drew it into existence from lines on paper. The importance of what Tharp had found was enormous. Her rift valley was the visible sign of what scientists would come to call seafloor spreading, the process by which new ocean floor is created at underwater ridges as the great plates of the Earth's surface move apart. Her map provided the visual evidence that helped persuade the scientific world to accept the theory of plate tectonics, one of the most important scientific revolutions of the 20th century. Tharp and Heezen continued their work for decades, eventually mapping the entire world ocean floor. Their greatest achievement was a panoramic painting of the ocean bottom, completed in 1977 by an Austrian artist working from Tharp's scientific data. The painting showed the ocean floor as if all the water had been drained away, revealing the full drama of its terrain. The mid-ocean ridges snaking around the globe like seams on a ball, the deep trenches plunging to extraordinary depths, the volcanic island chains, and the vast, silent plains of the deep sea. The technology that made Tharp's work possible was sonar, originally developed for detecting submarines during the two world wars. After the wars, the technique of bouncing sound waves off the ocean floor was adapted for scientific purposes, and research ships spent years crisscrossing the oceans collecting depth readings. Without this data, Tharp's maps would have been impossible. Tharp received limited recognition during her lifetime. She was awarded an honor from her research center in 2001, and in 1997, a national library named her one of the 4 greatest map makers of the 20th century. But for decades, her contribution was overshadowed by Hiesen's name, and the map that helped prove plate tectonics was often credited to him alone. Hiesen died in 1977, and Tharp spent her remaining years working to ensure her role was recognized. She died in 2006 at the age of 86. Today, mapping the ocean floor remains one of the great unfinished projects of cartography. As of recent years, only about a quarter of the world's ocean floor has been mapped to modern standards. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the floor of our own oceans. The task is immense. The ocean covers more than 360 million square kilometers, but every new survey reveals features, underwater mountains, canyons, coral formations that were completely unknown to science. Marie Tharp's story is one of the most quietly remarkable in the history of maps. She mapped a world she was never allowed to visit, discovered a feature that her own colleague dismissed, and produced the evidence for one of the greatest scientific discoveries of her century. And she did it all from a desk, with rulers and ink, because no one would let her go to sea. And now, let us rise from the ocean floor to the surface, where the maps of the 20th century were being shaped by the most destructive force in human affairs, war. In the summer of 1914, when British soldiers crossed the English Channel to fight in France, their officers carried maps that were almost laughably wrong for the war they were about to fight. The standard maps showed the landscape of northern France in broad strokes, fine for marching across open country, but useless for what came next. Within months, the Western Front had hardened into a maze of trenches, barbed wire, dugouts, and shell craters stretching from the sea to the Swiss border, and the army discovered that it had almost no ability to map this new and terrible landscape. The need was urgent and without precedent. Trench warfare required maps of extraordinary detail at very large scales. An artillery battery needed to know the exact position of an enemy machine gun to within a few meters. An infantry commander planning a raid needed to know the layout of the opposing trench system in detail, where the firing positions were, where the connecting passages ran, where the wire was thickest. These were features measured in feet and inches, not the miles of conventional military maps. The answer came from the sky. Cameras mounted on reconnaissance aircraft photographed the trenches from above, and teams of specialists back at headquarters studied the photographs, identifying new trenches, fortifications, and gun positions. The photographs were then used to update maps that were printed and sent to the front lines, often within days of the pictures being taken. The scale of this effort is staggering to consider. Over the course of the war, the British military alone printed roughly 34 million maps of the Western Front. These maps were constantly updated as the trench lines shifted, with new versions produced whenever significant changes were spotted in the aerial photographs. A grid reference system allowed any point on the battlefield to be identified with precision, enabling guns to fire at targets the gunners themselves could not see. The Second World War took military mapmaking to an entirely different level. The combined map production of the Allied nations during that war was close to 1 billion maps, the largest mapping effort in human history. Every campaign, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia to the beaches of France, required detailed maps at multiple scales, and the military mapping agencies worked day and night to produce them. The mapping effort for the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was perhaps the most intensive cartographic project of the entire war. The planners needed detailed maps of the French coast showing every building, every hedge, every road, and every enemy fortification. They needed charts showing the depth of water off the landing beaches, the locations of underwater obstacles, and the patterns of the tides. They needed geological maps to assess whether the ground could support the weight of tanks. They needed flight charts for the airborne troops who would land before the beach assault. Much of this information came from aerial photographs, with aircraft flying repeated missions over the coast. But some of the most important data came from more unusual sources. Underwater teams swam ashore at night to measure the slope of the beaches and test the firmness of the sand. And in one of the more charming episodes of military intelligence, the government broadcast a public appeal for holiday postcards and photographs from the French coast. Thousands of ordinary citizens sent in their pre-war vacation pictures, which intelligence officers used to identify coastal features and enemy positions. The Cold War transformed military map-making yet again, this time through satellites. The first American spy satellite program, which ran from 1959 to 1972, was publicly described as a scientific research project, but was actually designed to photograph the Soviet Union and other countries from orbit. The first successful mission returned images in August of 1960, and the results were a revelation. A single satellite mission photographed more territory than all the spy plane flights combined. The early cameras could identify objects about 25 feet across, and by the end of the program, the resolution had improved to about 6 feet, enough to spot individual aircraft on airfields and vehicles on roads. Over 12 years, the program recorded roughly 800,000 images covering 72 million square miles. The way the film was recovered sounds like something from a novel. The exposed film canister was ejected from the satellite, fell through the atmosphere on a parachute, and was caught in mid-air by a specially equipped airplane trailing a hook. If the plane missed, the canister was designed to float briefly and then sink to keep it from being captured by the other side. The first successful mid-air catch happened in August of 1960, making it the first time a man-made object had been recovered from orbit. The intelligence these satellites gathered was of incalculable value. They gave American planners an accurate picture of Soviet military capabilities, helping to prevent the kind of miscalculation that could have led to nuclear war. The photographs showed that the feared gap in missile numbers was largely a myth, that the Soviet Union had far fewer long-range missiles than American intelligence had guessed. When the satellite images were made public in the mid-1990s, scientists immediately saw their value for peaceful purposes. The photographs provided a record of what the Earth's surface looked like in the 1960s, a baseline that could be compared to modern images to study changes in land use, urban growth, forest loss, and the retreat of glaciers. Spy satellites designed to find missile bases had accidentally created one of the most valuable collections of Earth observation data in existence. The transformation from hand-drawn trench maps to satellite photographs in less than 50 years is one of the most dramatic leaps in the whole history of maps. War has always driven cartographic progress, not because maps are inherently military, but because the life and death stakes of warfare make geographic knowledge urgently valuable. The 34 million trench maps of the First War, the billion maps of the Second, and the hundreds of thousands of satellite images of the Cold War are monuments to the terrible ingenuity that conflict inspires. And now, let us turn to something equally unsettling but in a different way, the long tradition of maps that were designed not to tell the truth, but to tell a lie. In 1988, the chief map maker of the Soviet Union made an extraordinary public admission. For nearly 50 years, he revealed, every unclassified map published in the Soviet Union had been deliberately falsified. Rivers had been moved, Streets had been rearranged. Cities had been shifted from their true positions. Entire neighborhoods had been erased or relocated. The distortions were systematic and thorough, affecting every civilian map, atlas, and city directory in the country. The policy had begun in 1938, during the era of deep government suspicion and fear. The reasoning was simple. If a foreign intelligence service got hold of Soviet civilian maps, the deliberate errors would make them useless for military planning. An enemy airplane navigating by a Soviet city map would find that the streets did not lead where the map showed, that the bridges were not where they seemed to be, and that important buildings had been moved to fictional locations. It was, in effect, a massive exercise in geographic deception, an attempt to make the geography of the entire country unknowable to outsiders. But here's the irony. The policy also made Soviet geography difficult for Soviet citizens themselves. Taxi drivers in Moscow navigated by memorized routes because the city maps available to them were deliberately wrong. Hikers in the mountains learned not to trust the maps they could buy because trail locations, elevation data, and even the positions of villages had been altered. Emergency services struggled with inaccurate maps that could add precious time to their responses. A policy designed to protect the country from its enemies had the practical effect of making the country harder and more dangerous for its own people to live in. Soviet map distortion was perhaps the most extreme example of cartographic deception in the 20th century, but it was far from the only one. Maps have been used as tools of persuasion throughout history, and the methods of map manipulation are as varied as they are effective. Germany during the 1930s and 40s used maps extensively as tools of political persuasion, particularly in schools. Geography textbooks were redesigned to reflect the government's worldview, showing the country at the center of Europe, surrounded by threats, hemmed in by hostile neighbors. Maps presented the expansion into neighboring territories as a natural and inevitable process. A standard school atlas was revised to include maps showing communities of German-speaking people scattered across Eastern Europe, implicitly arguing that all those territories belonged within the borders of a greater state. During the Cold War, both sides used maps to shape how their own people saw the world. Western maps often used projections centered on the North Pole that made the distance between the United States and the Soviet Union appear far shorter than it was, reinforcing the sense that the threat was right over the horizon. Maps showing the spread of one political system or another used red shading that expanded outward like a rising tide, creating a visual impression of unstoppable advance that helped build support for particular policies. Even the choice of how to flatten the globe onto a flat page can carry political weight, whether the mapmaker intends it or not. As we explored in an earlier chapter, certain common projections enlarge the apparent size of lands near the poles and shrink the lands near the equator, making some parts of the world look far larger or smaller than they really are. The debate over which projection to use in schools and public settings is not merely a technical question. It is a question about whose view of the world gets to be the default. The practice of drawing election boundaries to favor one political party over another is another form of cartographic manipulation that remains a live issue in democracies around the world. The technique is named after a governor in the early 1800s who approved a district so oddly shaped that a newspaper cartoonist compared it to a salamander. The resulting word has been used ever since to describe the art of drawing voting maps to produce desired political results. In our own time, computers and detailed data have made this practice far more precise. Modern software can analyze voting patterns down to individual city blocks and draw district boundaries with surgical accuracy, packing opposition voters into a few overwhelming districts while spreading friendly voters efficiently across as many seats as possible. The resulting maps often look absurd, with districts that snake through cities, leap across rivers, and connect distant neighborhoods through thin strips of territory. The uncomfortable truth beneath all of these examples is that every map is, in some sense, an argument. Every map involves decisions about what to include and what to leave out, what to make large and what to make small, what to name and what to leave unnamed. These choices are never neutral. They reflect the interests and assumptions of the person who made the map, and they shape the perceptions and beliefs of the person who reads it. A map that shows national borders but not the boundaries of ethnic groups makes a statement about what matters. A map that labels mountains in the language of the colonizer rather than the colonized makes a statement about whose knowledge counts. A map that shows highways but not footpaths makes a statement about whose way of getting around is important. None of these choices require a deliberate desire to mislead. They are simply the unavoidable consequences of the fact that any picture of reality must choose what to include, and every act of choosing is also an act of interpretation. The history of maps that lied is, in the end, a reminder that knowing how to read maps critically, questioning their assumptions, noticing their biases, understanding the decisions behind them, is not merely a useful skill, it is an essential one. And now, let us turn to a gentler story, the story of a mapping agency that became so beloved that its maps appear on tea towels and birthday cakes. On June 21, 1791, a duke who served as the head of the military board responsible for fortifications and artillery purchased a piece of scientific equipment that would change the relationship between a nation and its landscape forever. The instrument was a theodolite, built by the finest instrument maker in London, and it was the best surveying device in the world. The Duke bought it not for personal use, but because Britain was at war with revolutionary France and the government feared an invasion of the southern coast. To plan defences, the military needed accurate maps, and Britain had none. The organisation that grew from that purchase became the Ordnance Survey, named after the military board that founded it. Its original purpose was strictly military, to map the coast of southern England in enough detail to plan defences against a French landing. The work built on earlier surveys conducted by a military officer who had measured a baseline on a heath near London using specially made glass rods, and who had dreamed of a complete triangulation of Britain but died before it could be done. The Ordnance Survey took up that dream and made it national policy. The first official map was published in 1801, covering the county of Kent at a scale of 1 inch to 1 mile. It was a military document intended for officers planning the defense of the vulnerable southeast coast. But even in that first map, the quality that would define the Ordnance Survey for centuries was already clear: an obsessive attention to detail, a determination to record every lane, every hedge, every building, every curve of the land with the greatest possible care. Over the decades that followed, the survey expanded northward and westward, mapping county after county. The work was slow and exhausting. Survey parties traveled on foot across every kind of terrain, measuring angles, recording features, and drawing sketches that would be assembled into finished maps back at headquarters. The mapping of Ireland, carried out between 1824 and 1846, was one of the largest surveys of the era and required a small army of surveyors working across the island. In 1935, the Ordnance Survey began one of its most ambitious projects, a complete remeasurement of Britain's triangulation network. The original network, laid down in the late 1700s and early 1800s, had grown outdated as better instruments became available. The new network required observation points across the entire country, and to support these observations, the survey built roughly 6,500 concrete pillars on prominent hilltops and mountain summits throughout Britain. These pillars, called trigonometric points or trig points, were simple structures, white concrete columns about 4 feet tall, with a brass plate on top for mounting a theodolite. They were placed so that from the top of any one pillar, at least 2 others could be seen, allowing the chain of triangles to extend across the whole country. The project was completed in 1962, and while satellite technology has since made the trig points unnecessary for actual surveying, hundreds of them remain standing on hilltops across Britain, quiet monuments to a bygone era of careful measurement. And here is a lovely thing. The trig points have become beloved landmarks in their own right. Hikers and walkers seek them out as destinations, and a dedicated community of enthusiasts has made it their goal to visit as many of the remaining pillars as possible, ticking them off like a birdwatcher recording species. Reaching the trig point on a summit has become, for many British walkers, the moment when you can truly say you have reached the top. The cultural importance of the Ordnance Survey goes far beyond its surveying work. In a country that takes its landscapes seriously, the maps produced by the survey have become something close to national treasures. You can find them printed on tea towels, shower curtains, mugs, birthday cakes, jigsaw puzzles, coasters, and phone cases. The orange cover of one popular map series and the pink cover of another are instantly recognizable to any British hiker. The map symbols, the tiny blue triangles for churches with towers, the dashed lines for footpaths, the little black dots for buildings, form a visual language that millions of people can read fluently. Imagine unfolding one of those maps on a rainy hillside, the paper slightly damp, the contour lines telling you exactly how steep the next climb will be, every fence, every stream, every footpath laid out before you. For many people in Britain, this is one of the small, reliable pleasures of life. The survey has adapted to the digital age while keeping its identity. In 2010, many of its datasets were made freely available to the public, answering the argument that geographic data paid for by the public should be accessible to everyone. The survey now produces digital maps alongside its traditional paper ones, and its data underpins everything from property sales to emergency services to city planning across the country. The story of the Ordnance Survey is, in a way, the story of a country's relationship with its own land. What began as a military necessity became a national project, then a cultural institution, and finally something close to a national obsession. No other country has quite the same relationship with its mapping agency, and no other mapping agency has become so deeply woven into the everyday life, the weekend walks, and the cultural identity of the nation it maps. The trig points may be outdated, the paper maps may be joined by phone apps, but the impulse that drove the purchase of that fine theodolite in 1791, the desire to know the land intimately, precisely, and completely, remains as strong as ever. And now, let us look upward to the moment when humans first saw their world from above and how that new perspective changed everything. On a clear day in 1858, a flamboyant Parisian photographer and balloonist rose above the city of Paris in a hot air balloon and pointed a camera at the ground. The picture he took that day, looking down at the rooftops and streets from several hundred feet in the air, was the first aerial photograph in history. The original image has been lost, but the earliest surviving aerial photograph, taken from a balloon over the city of Boston 2 years later, gives us a sense of what that pioneering view must have looked like, a slightly blurred, slightly tilted picture of the world from directly above, showing a perspective that no human eye had ever seen before the age of flight. That first photograph was a novelty, something that attracted attention but had no immediate practical use. The cameras of the 1850s needed long exposures, and a swaying balloon was not the steadiest of platforms, but the potential was obvious even at the time. A photograph taken from directly above showed the landscape as a kind of map already, with features in their correct positions, needing only scaling and orientation to become a useful geographic document. Some of the most creative early experiments with the view from above came not from balloons, but from an unexpected source, pigeons. In the early 1900s, a German inventor developed a tiny camera light enough to strap to a pigeon's chest. A timing device triggered the shutter at intervals as the bird flew, producing small photographs of the ground below. It was more novelty than science, but it showed just how deeply humans were drawn to the idea of seeing their world from above. The real transformation came with the airplane. When war broke out in 1914, military leaders quickly realized that aircraft with cameras could show them things about the enemy that were impossible to learn from the ground. By 1915, aerial photography had become standard military practice, and by the war's end, it had changed not just intelligence gathering, but map-making itself. Photographs taken from reconnaissance planes could be pieced together into large composite images covering wide areas, and these composites could serve as the basis for maps of remarkable detail. The next World War pushed the technology much further. Photographs taken from slightly different angles could be viewed through special devices that made them appear three-dimensional, and this technique became the standard tool for making detailed topographic maps. The quality of wartime photographs was extraordinary. Individual vehicles, gun positions, and even single soldiers could be identified in images taken from thousands of feet above. The next great leap came not from airplanes, but from rockets. In 1946, a captured German rocket launched from a testing ground in the American desert carried a camera to an altitude of 65 miles. The photographs it returned were rough by modern standards, but they showed something no human had ever seen: the curve of the Earth, the arc of the horizon, and the landscape laid out far below like a map come to life. The launch of imaging satellites in the 1960s, beginning with the secret spy programs we discussed in the previous chapter, brought the aerial viewpoint to its ultimate height. But it was the launch of a civilian satellite that truly opened this view to the world. In July of 1972, the American Space Agency launched a satellite designed specifically to observe the Earth's land surfaces for peaceful scientific purposes. It was the first satellite of its kind, and it began what is now the longest continuous program of Earth observation in history. This satellite orbited at about 900 kilometers above the surface, circling the planet every 99 minutes and imaging a wide strip of ground on each pass. Unlike the Spies satellites, which used photographic film that had to be physically recovered from orbit, this satellite transmitted its images electronically to stations on the ground, making the data available within days. It could detect not just visible light, but also invisible forms of radiation, allowing scientists to study the health of plants, the moisture in soil, the quality of water, and the structure of rocks in ways that the naked eye could never achieve. The program continued with a series of improved satellites, each more capable than the one before. Together, they have provided an unbroken record of what the Earth's surface looks like, spanning more than 50 years. This record has been used to track changes in forests, the growth of cities, the retreat of glaciers, and countless other ways in which human activity is reshaping the planet. Other countries followed with their own observation satellites. A French satellite launched in 1986 offered sharper images that opened new markets for satellite-based mapping. By the late 1990s, commercial satellites could see objects as small as 1 meter across, bringing satellite imagery into the lives of ordinary people, most visibly through services that let anyone zoom in on their own home from space. The most recent revolution in the view from above comes from two technologies that would have seemed like fantasy to that balloonist in Paris. The first is the drone. Small, affordable, and easy to fly, drones have made it possible for anyone to acquire aerial images at a fraction of the cost of traditional aircraft. A surveyor with a consumer-grade drone can map a building site, a farm, or an archaeological dig in hours, producing detailed models with accuracy down to the centimeter. The second technology uses laser pulses fired from aircraft or drones to measure the distance to the ground with extreme precision. This method can see through forest canopy, revealing the shape of the ground beneath the trees. In Central America, it has been used to find vast ancient cities hidden beneath dense jungle, complexes of buildings, roads, and fields that were invisible to ordinary cameras. These discoveries have rewritten our understanding of how large, and how advanced ancient civilizations in the Americas truly were. From a balloon over Paris to laser-equipped drones over the jungles of Guatemala, the view from above has changed map-making more deeply than any other technology in the field's long history. The ability to see the Earth from ever greater heights has not merely made our maps more accurate. It has changed our relationship with the land itself, giving us a perspective that was, for all of human history before 1858, available only in dreams. And now, let us come back down to Earth, and to the technology that put a map in every pocket. On the first day of September 1983, a passenger airplane carrying 269 people strayed into restricted airspace over the far eastern edge of the Soviet Union. The aircraft's navigation system had malfunctioned or been set incorrectly, causing it to wander hundreds of miles off course without the crew's knowledge. Soviet military forces, interpreting the deviation as a deliberate intrusion, sent fighter jets to intercept. In the early hours of the morning, one of those fighters fired 2 missiles at the passenger plane. It fell into the sea. Everyone aboard was killed. The tragedy was a product of Cold War paranoia and hair-trigger reflexes, but at its root, it was a failure of navigation. The airplane had gone where it was not supposed to go because the people flying it did not know with enough precision where they were. The disaster gave urgent weight to a decision that the American government had been considering for years, whether to make a military satellite navigation system available to civilian users. The system had begun development a decade earlier, when a small group of military officers gathered at the Pentagon to discuss a new kind of navigation. The idea was a constellation of satellites orbiting at roughly 20,000 kilometers above the Earth, each one broadcasting a precisely timed radio signal. A receiver on the ground, at sea, or in the air could pick up signals from at least 4 of these satellites and, by measuring the tiny differences in arrival time, calculate its own position to within a few meters. The first test satellite was launched in 1978, and the full network of 24 operational satellites was declared complete in 1993. But from the beginning, the system had 2 levels of accuracy. Military receivers could use the full precision of the signal, placing themselves to within about 20 meters. Civilian receivers were deliberately given a degraded signal through a feature called selective availability that limited their accuracy to about 100 meters. The reasoning was straightforward. The military did not want potential enemies to use American satellites to aim their weapons. The decision to open the system to civilians came in direct response to the airplane disaster. The American president announced that the satellite system would be made available to civilian aviation to prevent similar tragedies. But the deliberate blurring of the civilian signal remained in place. It took another 17 years for that last barrier to fall. At midnight on May 1, 2000, another American president ordered selective availability switched off. The change was instant and dramatic. Civilian receivers jumped from accuracy of about 100 meters to about 20 meters, and with additional correction systems down to a few meters or even centimeters. The vice president of the time described the decision as the biggest change in navigation since the invention of the compass. The impact on everyday life has been so thorough that it is hard to list completely. Before this technology, driving to an unfamiliar address required a paper map, a sense of direction, and sometimes the courage to stop and ask a stranger for help. After it, turn-by-turn directions became available to anyone, first in dedicated devices mounted on car dashboards, and later, after the smartphone arrived in 2007, in the pocket of virtually everyone. More than 2 billion people now regularly use mapping applications on their phones. But the effects go far beyond driving directions. Modern farming uses satellite-guided tractors to plant, water, and harvest crops with precision down to the centimeter, reducing waste and increasing the amount of food that can be grown. Emergency services locate callers and dispatch help to exact addresses. Shipping companies track containers across oceans in real time, Rescue teams coordinate searches in wilderness areas. Scientists measure the movement of the Earth's great plates at a pace of millimeters per year. The military uses remain formidable. Satellite-guided weapons, first used widely during a war in the early 1990s, allow a bomb to be delivered to a target with accuracy measured in meters rather than miles. The strategic importance of this capability has not been lost on other nations. Russia, Europe, China, India, and Japan have all built or are building their own satellite navigation systems, ensuring that no single country holds a monopoly on the ability to know precisely where things are. There is also a deeper, more philosophical question that this technology raises. For most of human history, knowing where you were required skill, experience, and attention. A sailor needed to read the stars. A walker needed to read the landscape. A driver needed to read a map. Satellite navigation has made all of these skills optional. Researchers have found that heavy use of this technology can actually reduce the size of the brain region associated with spatial memory, and that people who rely on satellite directions develop weaker mental pictures of their surroundings than those who navigate by other means. There is something both freeing and unsettling about a technology that always knows where you are. It has made it nearly impossible to become truly lost, which is a remarkable achievement in the long story of navigation. But it has also made it nearly impossible to avoid being found, which is something rather different. The same satellites that guide hikers to mountain summits and help lost drivers find their way home also allow governments and companies to track the movements of individuals with a precision that no earlier age could have dreamed of. The journey from that fatal navigational error in 1707 to a world where billions of people carry satellite receivers in their pockets has taken just over 3 centuries. The problem of knowing where you are has been transformed from one of the most dangerous challenges in human experience into something so routine that we hardly think about it. The solution, when it finally arrived, came not from a single genius or a single invention, but from a network of satellites circling the Earth in silence, each one broadcasting a tiny signal that says precisely and continuously, "Here is where you are." And now, let us follow that signal into the digital world, where maps have become something anyone can make, share, and carry in a pocket. In the spring of 1962, a young geographer found himself on an airplane sitting next to someone who worked for a computer company. The conversation that followed would change the history of map making as profoundly as the printing press had 4 centuries earlier. The geographer had been working on a problem: how to manage the enormous amounts of geographic information being generated by a national survey of Canadian land, its soil, forests, wildlife, and agricultural potential. Paper maps could show the data, but they could not analyze it. You could look at one map of soil and another of rainfall and another of forest cover, but comparing them, asking questions like which areas have both good soil and enough rain and are not currently covered by trees, required a kind of spatial thinking that paper simply could not do. The connection to computing power gave this geographer what he needed, and by 1966 he had developed the first true geographic information system. The concept of using computers to store, manage, analyze, and display geographic data has since grown into an industry worth billions, underpinning everything from city planning to disaster response to farming. But that early system was a tool for specialists, available only to trained professionals with access to expensive machines. The true opening up of geographic information to everyone would take several more decades and several more technological leaps. The critical moment came in 2004, when a large technology company acquired a small firm that had developed a program allowing users to explore satellite images of the Earth on their personal computers. The product was relaunched the following year, and the response was extraordinary. Within its first year, it was downloaded by more than 100 million people. The experience of zooming in on your own house from a view high above the Earth became one of the defining technological moments of the early 21st century. The same company also launched a companion product for street maps and driving directions, which within months became part of everyday life for hundreds of millions of people. When the company opened its mapping platform to outside developers, allowing anyone to build custom maps using its geographic data, the result was an explosion of new kinds of maps. People created maps showing crime statistics laid over city streets, restaurant reviews arranged by location, and political donations organized by neighborhood. Anyone with some programming skill could create a map and share it with the world. A street-level view of the world, captured by cameras mounted on specially equipped vehicles driving through cities, added another dimension. For the first time, you could not just see a satellite view of a distant place, but virtually walk down its streets, reading signs and looking at buildings. This technology eventually covered millions of miles of road in dozens of countries, creating the most complete visual record of the built environment ever assembled. But the opening up of maps was not driven by a single company. In the same year, 2004, a British entrepreneur founded a project that applied the model of the free online encyclopedia to map making. His motivation was partly practical. The National Mapping Agency charged for its data, and he believed geographic information should be freely available to everyone. His project allowed any volunteer to contribute mapping data, building a free, editable map of the entire world. The project grew slowly at first, but gained speed as its community of volunteer mappers expanded. It proved especially valuable in places where commercial companies had little reason to invest, developing countries, rural areas, and regions struck by natural disasters. When a devastating earthquake hit Haiti in 2010, volunteers around the world worked together to map the affected areas within days, producing the most up-to-date maps available to the relief agencies at a time when every other source of geographic information was outdated or destroyed. The smartphone, arriving in 2007, put maps in the pockets of billions of people. The combination of a satellite receiver, a cellular connection, and a touchscreen created a device that was, among many other things, the most powerful personal navigation tool ever invented. Voice-guided directions, once available only in expensive dashboard devices, became a standard feature of every phone. The need to unfold a paper map or ask a stranger for directions became, for a growing majority of the world's population, a thing of the past. The professional side of geographic information also grew enormously. Software companies built platforms that allowed businesses, governments, and researchers to analyze geographic data with ever greater sophistication. By 2025, the global market for this kind of software was estimated at roughly $9.5 billion, with applications in nearly every field you can imagine. The benefits of this revolution are clear. Aid organizations use volunteer-built maps to coordinate disaster relief. Citizens use mapping tools to hold governments accountable. Scientists study climate change and track endangered species using satellite data. Students can explore the geography of the whole planet from a classroom desk. But the opening of maps to everyone has also brought new worries. The location data collected by mapping apps and smartphone sensors creates detailed records of where individuals go, how long they stay, and by implication, why they went there. This information has value to advertisers who use it to aim marketing at people based on where they are, and to governments who can request it for law enforcement. The technology that freed us from ever being lost also made it possible for us to be tracked more thoroughly than at any previous point in human history. The transformation from that mainframe computer in Ottawa to a world where 2 billion people carry mapping devices in their pockets has taken barely 60 years. In that time, the power to create, share, and use maps has shifted from a small group of trained professionals to virtually anyone with a phone and an internet connection. This is one of the most profound openings of knowledge in human history, comparable to the invention of the printing press. And like the printing press, it has brought both liberation and new forms of control, and we are still working out what it all means. And now, let us turn to the lighter side of the story, to the mistakes, the tricks, and the imaginary places that have found their way onto the world's maps and sometimes refuse to leave. In November of 2012, a team of Australian scientists aboard a research ship sailed to a spot in the Coral Sea, roughly halfway between Australia and New Caledonia, where every major map in the world showed an island. The island was called Sandy Island, and it had appeared on charts since at least 1876, when a passing ship had reported heavy waves and sandy formations in the area. Sandy Island was a fixture of world cartography. It appeared on maps published by major geographic societies. It was charted on French naval maps. It was labeled on digital mapping services, and it sat at its recorded coordinates on every mapping platform in the world. When the research ship arrived at the charted position, the scientists found open ocean. There was no island, no reef, no shallow water of any kind. Their depth instruments showed more than 1,400 meters of water beneath the hull. Sandy Island did not exist, and so far as anyone could tell, it never had. The scientists reported their finding, and within a matter of days, the island was removed from digital maps around the world. A piece of land that had been on charts for over a century vanished in the space of a week. Sandy Island was what mapmakers call a phantom island, one of the most curious categories of cartographic error. Phantom islands are land masses that appear on maps but do not exist in reality. Some were honest mistakes, the result of clouds, fog banks, or tricks of light seen by tired or hopeful sailors. Some were deliberate inventions created to stake a claim over land that was not really there. Others arose from navigational errors, when a ship's uncertain position led to a real sighting being recorded in the wrong spot, creating a ghost that later mapmakers faithfully copied from one chart to the next. The history of maps is full of phantom islands. One legendary island, said to lie somewhere in the Atlantic west of Ireland, appeared on maps from the 1300s onward and was not removed from official British charts until 1865. Another large island, supposedly located between Iceland and Greenland, first appeared on a map in the 1500s and continued to show up on maps well into the 1600s, even though nobody could ever find it. The most spectacular cartographic error to appear on a whole continent was not an island but a mountain range. In 1798, a British mapmaker drew a great chain of mountains stretching across the entire width of West Africa. He based the mountains partly on vague reports from an explorer who had traveled in the region, and partly on his own theories about the course of a major river. The explorer had mentioned elevated ground, but he never claimed to have seen a continuous mountain range. The mapmaker, interpreting the reports through his own assumptions, expanded the hints into a massive chain running from east to west. These phantom mountains appeared on maps for nearly a century. Scholars have counted at least 40 maps between 1798 and 1892 that show them. What makes the story so striking is not just that the error lasted so long, but that it survived despite repeated failures to confirm that the mountains existed. Travelers who passed through the region where the mountains were supposed to be found no mountains, but rather than concluding they were not there, mapmakers simply moved them further into the unmapped interior where no one could prove them wrong. It was a case of the map's authority being trusted more than the actual experience of people who had been to the place. A French explorer finally put the myth to rest in the late 1880s when he traveled through the heart of West Africa and found flat ground where the mountains were supposed to stand. A different kind of cartographic trick is the trap street, a fictional feature deliberately placed on a map to catch anyone who copies the work without permission. Because creating an accurate map takes enormous time, skill, and money, mapmakers have long worried about competitors simply reproducing their maps. To catch cheaters, some publishers slipped in small invented features, a street that does not exist, a slight curve added to a straight road, a tiny village with a made-up name. If a rival's map contained the same fictional detail, it was proof of copying. The most delightful example of a trap becoming real is the story of a small place in New York State. In 1925, two mapmakers at a drafting company created a fictitious settlement and placed it on their map at the intersection of two dirt roads in the Catskill Mountains using a name made from their own initials. The idea was simple. If the name appeared on a competitor's map, they would know their work had been stolen. But then, something wonderful happened. Someone opened a general store at that very intersection and named it after the place shown on the map, presumably because the map said that was what the place was called. When a rival company later published a map that included the name, the original map makers threatened to sue. The rival's defense was that the place was real, it had a store, it appeared on local maps, and people knew it by that name. The fiction had created its own reality. A place invented to catch cheaters had become, however briefly, a real settlement on the map of New York. The store eventually closed, but the name continued to appear on maps for decades afterward. This raises a question that goes to the heart of what maps really are. If a map maker invents a place, and people start treating it as real, and it takes on a physical presence in the world, was it ever truly a mistake? Maps do not simply mirror reality, they shape it.
A road drawn on a map may cause a road to be built.
A border drawn on a map may divide a nation. A city marked on a map may attract settlers who would never have gone there otherwise. Phantom islands, fictional mountains, and trap streets remind us that the authority of maps rests on trust, and that trust, once given, is remarkably stubborn. For most of history, very few people had the means to check whether a map was right. If a respected map showed an island at certain coordinates, sailors expected to find it, and if they did not, they were more likely to doubt their own navigation than to question the map. Errors, once committed to paper or parchment, could survive for decades or centuries, copying themselves from one map to the next. There is something both humbling and charming in these stories. They remind us that even our most trusted representations of the world are, in the end, human creations, subject to all the mistakes, assumptions, and small deceptions that come with being made by human hands. And now, let us look ahead to where the story of maps goes from here, and to the question of whether the ancient impulse to draw the world will survive in a digital age. In a laboratory in California, a computer system is processing millions of street-level images, automatically identifying traffic signals, road signs, lane markings, and obstacles with a speed and accuracy that no human mapmaker could match. The system is creating what the industry calls a high-definition map, an extraordinarily detailed digital picture of the road environment, accurate to the centimeter. This map is not designed for human eyes. It is designed for machines, for the self-driving vehicles that their creators believe will, within the coming years, change how people move through the world. These vehicles cannot navigate by the approximate information that satisfies a human driver. They need to know the exact position of every curb, every lane boundary, every traffic light, updated continuously as the world around them changes. The making of maps for self-driving vehicles may be one of the most demanding cartographic challenges in all of history. A regular road map shows where roads go. A map for a machine shows everything: the precise shape of the road surface, the height of every curb, the exact location of every sign, and even the expected behavior of other drivers at particular spots. Companies around the world are spending billions of dollars building and maintaining these maps, which must be constantly refreshed to reflect construction, road changes, and the shifting details of the world. Artificial intelligence is changing not just how maps are used, but how they are made. Computer programs can now process satellite images to identify buildings, roads, vegetation, and water features automatically, producing mapping data at a speed that would take teams of human mapmakers months or years. These systems can spot changes in the landscape by comparing new images with older ones, flagging new construction, the loss of forest, flooding, or other changes for review. The technology is especially valuable in rapidly growing areas where informal settlements can spring up faster than any survey team could record them. But there are cautions too. These computer systems can sometimes produce features that do not exist or misidentify what they see in images. The habits and biases built into the data they learn from can lead to systematic errors, with some kinds of terrain or buildings consistently misread. And because these systems are complex, it can be hard to understand exactly why a particular mistake was made. The history of maps is, as we have seen, a history of errors that persist because people trust them. Computer-generated maps may introduce new kinds of errors that are even harder to catch. The blending of digital information with the physical world is another frontier. A feature that allows you to hold up your phone, point its camera at the street, and see directional arrows and labels floating over the real scene is already available. As the glasses and headsets that display this kind of information become more capable and more affordable, navigation data will increasingly appear right in front of your eyes as you walk, overlaid on the world itself rather than shown on a separate screen. The possibilities are exciting. You could walk through an unfamiliar city and see not just directions but historical information, restaurant reviews, and real-time bus schedules hovering over the buildings around you. But there are also concerns. Those who have access to this layered information will experience a richly annotated world, while those without it will see the same streets stripped of context. And the power to decide what information appears and what does not raises questions about who controls the picture of the world that millions of people see every day. Beyond our own planet, maps are reaching into space. Space agencies have produced detailed maps of Mars using instruments aboard orbiting spacecraft, and these maps have been used to choose landing sites for rovers, identify potential sources of water ice, and plan for eventual human exploration. The mapping of the Moon, of asteroids, and of the moons of distant planets is progressing too, carrying the ancient impulse to draw the world outward to places our ancestors could never have imagined. Closer to home, the ocean floor remains one of the great unmapped frontiers. Only about a quarter of the world's ocean bottom has been mapped to modern standards, even though the ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface. A global effort aims to finish the job by the end of this decade, but the task is vast. Every new survey reveals things that were completely unknown: underwater mountains, vast coral formations, deep canyons. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the floor of our own sea. And perhaps the most meaningful cartographic development of our time is the movement by indigenous peoples around the world to reclaim their right to make their own maps. Using modern tools, satellite receivers, drones, and computer mapping systems, communities across every inhabited continent are mapping their traditional lands, recording their place names, drawing their own boundaries, and creating maps that reflect their own knowledge of the world rather than the knowledge of distant governments or colonial powers. These projects challenge the idea that maps are neutral, objective pictures of reality. They insist that every map is an argument, and that the right to make that argument belongs to the people who live on the land. The work of restoring indigenous names, mapping traditional territories, and creating representations that honor local knowledge is not just a technical exercise, it is an act of cultural self-determination, a declaration that the people who know a place best should be the ones who say what it is called and where its edges lie. And so, as we come to the end of this long journey through the story of maps, let us pause and look back at the ground we have covered together. We began in the red heart of Australia, where an elder sang a landscape into being. We followed the story to the clay plains of Mesopotamia, where scribes pressed styluses into wet tablets to record the shape of cities and fields. We walked with the rope stretchers of Egypt, measured the earth with the Greeks, and traveled the Roman roads that still shape the landscape of Europe. We sailed with the Polynesian navigators across the Pacific, guided by nothing but the stars and the feel of the waves. We explored the golden age of Islamic map-making, the strange and beautiful theology of medieval European maps, and the sudden appearance of the Portolan charts that drew the Mediterranean with startling accuracy. We traveled to China and Korea, to India and Japan, to the Aztec capital with its pictographic maps. We watched the Americas appear on European maps for the first time, saw Mercator wrestle with the problem of flattening a sphere, and followed the spies who stole maps worth more than gold. We met the sea monsters at the edges of the world and spent time with the atlas makers of Amsterdam. We measured France with the Cassini family, solved the longitude problem with a self-taught clockmaker, and sailed with Cook into the last blank spaces on European charts. We saw maps used as tools of empire and as instruments of propaganda. We watched a London doctor use a map to trace a deadly disease, and we followed the secret surveyors who mapped Tibet in disguise. We learned how contour lines taught maps to show height, and how a woman working at a desk in New York drew the ocean floor and helped prove that the continents move. We traced the path from trench maps to spy satellites, from deliberate lies on Soviet maps to the opening of geographic knowledge to everyone through digital technology. And we paused to smile at the phantom islands and the trap streets that remind us that even maps can make mistakes. Through all of this, one thread has remained constant: the deeply human need to know where we are and to share that knowledge with others. From songs sung under southern stars to satellite signals circling the globe, from scratches on stone to pixels on a screen, the impulse to draw the world and hold it in our hands has been with us for as long as we have been human. The tools will keep changing. The impulse will not. And so, if you are still with me, let your eyes close now. Let the long story of maps settle over you like a gentle blanket. Think of all those map makers across the centuries, the rope stretchers and the star readers, the monks and the admirals, the spies and the scientists, each one adding a few more lines to our picture of the world. They did their work so that we might know where we are. Rest now. You know where you are. You are right here, safe and warm, at the end of a very long and very beautiful story. Good night.